Imagine waking up one day and finally understanding why you feel the way you do. Why some days you feel motivated and confident, and other days you feel stuck, anxious, or completely overwhelmed. Now imagine having a simple set of tools that help you handle stress, calm anxiety, deal with self-doubt, and turn bad days into better ones. The truth is, most of us were never taught how our minds actually work. No one showed us how to deal with painful emotions, negative thoughts, or the pressure of everyday life. So when things get hard, we assume something is wrong with us. But what if the problem isn't you? What if you were just never given the right tools? In this audiobook summary of Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before? By Dr. Julie Smith, you'll discover powerful insights from psychology that are usually taught in therapy rooms, but explained here in a simple, practical way that anyone can use. You'll learn why your mood changes and how to influence it, how to stop negative thinking from controlling your life, what actually works for anxiety, stress, and self-doubt, and how small daily habits can transform your mental health. These aren't complicated theories. They are real tools that thousands of people use to navigate life's hardest moments. So if you've ever asked yourself, why do I feel like this? Why is it so hard to stay motivated? Why does my mind work against me sometimes? Then this audiobook might give you answers you've been looking for. Because once you understand how your mind works, everything starts to change. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin exploring the tools that can help you build a stronger, calmer, and more resilient mind, and use headphones for better understanding. When we talk about mental health in a self-help audiobook or a book summary like this one of the most important things to understand is something that almost every human experiences but rarely talks about openly: low mood. Not clinical depression necessarily, not a full emotional breakdown, but those quiet, heavy days when everything feels a little harder than it should. The kind of day where getting out of bed feels like a negotiation with gravity, your coffee tastes slightly less exciting than usual, and your brain insists on replaying every awkward moment you've had since 2008. If you've ever had days like that, congratulations, you're human. And this audiobook summary begins with an important truth. Low mood is not a personal failure. It's a natural part of the human emotional system. In many self-help book summaries and motivational audiobooks, people are often told to just think positive, as if the human brain were a light switch you could flip from gloomy to sunshine with a motivational quote. But real psychology tells a more interesting story. Your mood isn't created by just one thing. It's not simply in your head. Instead, it's shaped by a complex interaction between your body, your thoughts, your behavior, and your environment. Your brain is constantly collecting clues from your body, your energy levels, your sleep, your hunger, and also from your surroundings and your thoughts. Then it makes its best guess about how you should feel. Sometimes that guess becomes joy. Sometimes it becomes stress. And sometimes it becomes low mood. Think about it this way. Imagine you wake up after a night of poor sleep. Maybe you stayed up too late watching videos you promised yourself you'd only watch for 5 minutes. Suddenly, it's 2 a.m. and you're deeply invested in a documentary about penguins. The next morning, your body feels exhausted, your brain feels foggy, and your patience is about as thin as your phone battery. Your brain receives signals from your body saying something isn't quite right. So it starts looking for reasons why. That slight headache, the messy kitchen, the long to-do list waiting for you. Suddenly they feel like evidence that the day is going to be terrible. Your mood drops, and before you know it, you're convinced the entire universe has conspired against you before breakfast. This is one of the key insights shared in this self-help audiobook and book summary. Mood is influenced by many factors working together. Your sleep, hydration, movement, social connections, thoughts, and habits all play a role. The brain is not a perfect storyteller. It's more like a detective working with limited clues. It tries to explain the signals it receives from your body and your environment. If those signals suggest stress, fatigue, or discomfort, the brain often interprets them as a sign that something is wrong. But here's the empowering part. Because mood is influenced by many things, it also means there are many ways to influence it in return. You may not be able to instantly command your brain to feel happy, but you can adjust the ingredients that shape how you feel. And this idea sits at the heart of this audiobook summary. Another important insight discussed in this self-help book summary is that low mood often creates a cycle. When you feel low, your thoughts tend to become more negative. When your thoughts become more negative, your actions often change. You might withdraw from people, avoid activities you usually enjoy, or spend more time alone scrolling through your phone while your brain quietly narrates a dramatic story about how nothing ever works out. The more you disengage from positive activities, the worse your mood becomes. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a downward spiral, and the tricky part is that low mood often urges you to do exactly the things that keep the spiral going. However, understanding this pattern gives you something incredibly valuable: awareness. Awareness creates choice. Once you begin to notice how your thoughts, behaviors, and physical state interact with your mood, you can start making small changes that interrupt the cycle. And small changes matter more than most people realize. In fact, one of the biggest myths about improving mood is that you need massive life transformations. In reality, it's often the small shifts that slowly change the direction of your emotional state. For example, moving your body when you feel low might feel like the last thing you want to do. Your brain might argue that lying on the couch is a strategic life decision. But physical movement sends powerful signals back to the brain that the body is active and engaged. Even a short walk can begin to change the emotional feedback loop. The same applies to simple actions like drinking water, stepping outside, connecting with someone, or doing something small that normally brings you a sense of accomplishment. Another powerful takeaway from this self-help audiobook and book summary is that emotions are not fixed identities. Feeling low does not mean you are a negative person, a weak person, or a broken person. It simply means your brain is responding to the information it has received. Emotions are experiences, not definitions of who you are. And once you understand that, the experience of low mood becomes less frightening. Instead of fighting your emotions or judging yourself for having them, you can begin to observe them with curiosity. In many ways, understanding low mood is like learning the operating system of your mind. Before you understand it, everything feels random and confusing. But once you start seeing the patterns, the connection between thoughts, body, actions, and emotions, the system becomes easier to navigate. And that's the purpose of this audiobook summary. Not to eliminate low mood forever, because that would mean eliminating part of what makes us human. Instead, the goal is to give you the tools to recognize it, understand it, and gently guide your mind back toward balance when life inevitably knocks things a little off course. As we continue this self-help audiobook summary, building on what we just explored about understanding low mood, we now move into something equally important: the subtle traps that can quietly pull our mood downward if we're not aware of them. Because here's the fascinating truth we often overlook. Low mood doesn't usually appear out of nowhere like a sudden thunderstorm. More often, it sneaks in through small psychological habits, tiny mental shortcuts, and everyday behaviors that slowly shape how we feel. And in this audiobook and book summary, we're going to explore some of those common mood pitfalls that many of us fall into without even realizing it. Now, if you're listening to this audiobook and thinking, wait, are you telling me my own brain might be setting traps for my mood? Well, Yes, sometimes it does. But before we blame the brain completely, it's important to remember that your mind is actually trying to protect you. It evolved to detect problems, anticipate danger, and solve challenges. The issue is that this survival system, which worked wonderfully when humans were avoiding predators thousands of years ago, sometimes becomes a little overenthusiastic in modern life. Instead of spotting a tiger in the bushes, it starts spotting problems in emails, social media comments, or that one awkward conversation you had last Tuesday. One of the most common mood pitfalls we encounter is what psychologists often call rumination, the mental habit of replaying negative thoughts again and again like a song stuck on repeat. And if we're being honest, most of us have experienced this at some point. You might be trying to relax at night, when suddenly your brain decides it's the perfect time to replay that embarrassing thing you said in a meeting 3 years ago. Your body is in bed, but your brain has decided to host a late-night documentary titled Every Awkward Moment of Your Life. Not exactly the relaxing entertainment we were hoping for. In this self-help audiobook and book summary, we recognize that rumination feels productive because it tricks us into believing we're solving a problem. But in reality, repeatedly analyzing the same negative thought rarely brings clarity. Instead, it keeps the emotional wound fresh. Your mind circles around the problem, but it doesn't move toward a solution. And the longer that cycle continues, the more it feeds low mood. Another powerful mood pitfall we often encounter is withdrawal. When we feel low, our natural instinct is to retreat, to cancel plans, avoid conversations, and disconnect from the activities that once brought us energy. On the surface, this can feel comforting. After all, if you're feeling down, staying under a blanket with your phone might seem like the safest place in the world. And sometimes, a little rest really is helpful. But when withdrawal becomes a long-term pattern, it can quietly shrink our world. In this audiobook summary, we begin to understand that our mood is closely connected to our actions. When we stop engaging with people, hobbies, and meaningful experiences, our brain receives fewer signals of reward, connection, and progress. And without those signals, low mood can deepen. It's almost like removing fuel from a fire. Except in this case, the fire is motivation, curiosity, and joy. Then there is another subtle mood trap that many listeners of this self-help audiobook will immediately recognize: the comparison habit. In the modern world, we have constant access to curated snapshots of other people's lives, their achievements, vacations, perfect meals, and suspiciously flawless morning routines. And while scrolling through these highlights might seem harmless, our brain often interprets them in a very specific way. It quietly asks, "Why isn't my life like that?" Of course, the brain conveniently forgets that social media is essentially a highlight reel. Nobody is posting pictures of the argument they had 5 minutes earlier or the laundry pile that currently looks like a small mountain. Yet our minds still compare our everyday reality to someone else's carefully edited moments. And that comparison can slowly erode our mood without us even noticing. Another fascinating pitfall explored in this audiobook and book summary is the habit of believing every thought our brain produces. Our minds generate thousands of thoughts every single day, and not all of them are accurate, helpful, or even rational. But when we're in a low mood, our brain tends to produce more critical and pessimistic thoughts. And if we automatically accept those thoughts as facts, they begin shaping how we see ourselves and the world. For example, one mistake might lead the mind to say, "I always mess things up." One difficult day might lead to the conclusion, "Nothing ever works out for me." These thoughts feel convincing in the moment, but they're often exaggerations created by an emotional brain searching for explanations. And this is where awareness becomes incredibly powerful. Because once we recognize these mood pitfalls, rumination, withdrawal, comparison, and unquestioned negative thinking, we gain the ability to pause and gently challenge them. Awareness doesn't instantly erase difficult emotions, but it creates a small space between the thought and the reaction. And in that space, something remarkable happens. Choice appears. So as we continue this self-help book summary, we begin to see that protecting our mood is not about forcing ourselves to feel happy all the time. It's about learning to recognize the quiet habits that influence our emotional state. And once you start noticing these patterns in your own mind, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with a little humor, you may realize that your brain is not an enemy working against you. It's simply a powerful system that occasionally needs guidance. And the good news is that guidance is exactly what you are learning to give it. After understanding low mood and recognizing the hidden pitfalls that can quietly pull our emotions downward, we arrive at something hopeful, practical, and empowering. The simple but powerful things that actually help lift our mood and bring balance back to the mind. Because once we recognize the patterns that influence how you feel, the next natural question becomes, what can we do about it? And the beautiful truth shared in this audiobook and book summary is that improving your mood doesn't require a dramatic life overhaul, a tropical vacation, or becoming the kind of person who wakes up at 5 a.m. and drinks green juice while journaling about gratitude. Sometimes, it starts with much smaller and more human actions. One of the first things we learn in this self-help audiobook is that action often comes before motivation, not the other way around. This idea surprises many people because your brain loves to argue the opposite. When you feel low, your mind tends to say, I'll do something productive once I feel better. But psychology tells us something fascinating. The act of doing something, no matter how small, can begin to shift your mood. Motivation doesn't always arrive first like a heroic movie soundtrack. Sometimes it quietly appears after you take the first step. So in this audiobook summary, we encourage you to think small but intentional. A short walk, a brief conversation with a friend, tidying one corner of your room, or completing one simple task can create a ripple effect inside the brain. These actions send signals that say, something is happening, we're moving forward. And the brain responds to those signals by adjusting how it feels. Another powerful tool discussed in this self-help book summary is physical movement. Now, before your brain imagines an exhausting workout routine or a dramatic fitness montage, let's pause for a moment. Movement doesn't have to mean running a marathon or lifting weights like an action hero. Even gentle movement, stretching, walking, or stepping outside for fresh air can influence your emotional state. Your body and your mind are constantly communicating with each other, and when your body begins to move, it sends messages back to the brain that can help regulate stress, release tension, and create a sense of momentum. Then there's something else that plays a surprisingly powerful role in mood: connection. Humans are social creatures, even the ones who proudly claim they prefer the company of their couch and a streaming service. In this audiobook and book summary, we explore how meaningful connection with others can act like emotional oxygen for the brain. A simple conversation, a shared laugh, or even a brief moment of understanding with another person can remind your nervous system that you are not alone. And sometimes that reminder is enough to soften the weight of a difficult day. Another fascinating insight shared in this self-help audiobook is the importance of self-compassion. Many of us have developed the habit of speaking to ourselves in ways we would never speak to a friend. If a friend made a mistake, you might respond with patience and encouragement. But when you make a mistake, the inner voice suddenly becomes a very harsh critic. It's almost as if a strict movie judge moved into your brain and started reviewing every action with dramatic disappointment. But here's the psychological truth explored in this audiobook summary. Harsh self-criticism rarely improves performance or mood. In fact, it often deepens feelings of failure and discouragement. Self-compassion, on the other hand, creates the emotional safety needed to learn, grow, and move forward. Treating yourself with the same patience you would offer someone you care about is not weakness. It's a powerful mental skill. Another helpful shift we explore together in this book summary is learning to question your thoughts rather than automatically believing them. Your brain produces thousands of thoughts every day, and some of them are incredibly helpful. Others are, well, let's just say they're about as reliable as a weather forecast predicting sunshine during a thunderstorm. When you begin to notice your thoughts instead of instantly accepting them as facts, something important happens. Your relationship with those thoughts changes. Instead of being controlled by them, you become the observer of them. And finally, one of the most important ideas in this self-help audiobook is learning to focus on values rather than feelings alone. Feelings change constantly, sometimes hour by hour. But values, what truly matters to you, the kind of person you want to be, the way you want to treat others, can act like a compass. Even on days when motivation is low or emotions feel heavy, values can guide your actions in a meaningful direction. So as we continue this audiobook, remember this simple but powerful message. Improving your mood is rarely about one big transformation. It's about a collection of small, intentional choices, movement, connection, self-compassion, curiosity toward your thoughts, and actions guided by what truly matters. And sometimes, the smallest step forward is the one that quietly changes everything. And as I continue this journey with you, building on everything we've explored so far, understanding low mood, recognizing the quiet traps that pull our emotions downward, and discovering small actions that help shift our mental state, we arrive at a question every human being eventually asks. What do we do when we're simply having a bad day? Because no matter how much emotional wisdom we gather, no matter how mindful or self-aware we become, life still delivers those days where things feel heavier than usual. The alarm rings too early, the coffee spills, an email ruins the morning, and suddenly your brain starts narrating the entire day like it's the trailer for a very dramatic movie. So let me start with an important truth. A bad day does not mean a bad life. It doesn't even mean a bad week. It simply means your mind and body are responding to a moment in time. But here's where things become interesting from a psychological perspective. While we cannot always control when a bad day begins, we often have more influence over how it unfolds than we realize. One of the most powerful shifts I want you to consider is the idea that emotions move in waves. Your brain, however, has a habit of telling a much more dramatic story. When things go wrong early in the day, your mind may quickly jump to sweeping conclusions. It might whisper things like, well, this entire day is ruined, or nothing ever works out. Your brain loves these grand, cinematic conclusions. Unfortunately, they're usually about as accurate as predicting the entire weather forecast based on one cloud. What actually happens on difficult days is far more fluid. Emotions rise and fall depending on what we do next. And this is where a subtle but powerful skill comes into play, interrupting the emotional spiral. When something frustrating happens, your brain immediately begins constructing a narrative around it. Maybe someone ignores your message, and suddenly your mind starts building an elaborate psychological thriller about why they must secretly dislike you. Within minutes, you've created a full storyline, a soundtrack, and possibly a sequel. But the reality is often much simpler. They might just be busy, or asleep, or stuck in a meeting wondering why the projector refuses to cooperate. The key insight here is that your thoughts influence how long a bad moment becomes a bad day. When the mind starts building negative stories, gently stepping back and questioning those thoughts can loosen their grip. Not every thought deserves to be treated like a fact. Sometimes it's simply your brain trying to make sense of incomplete information. Another powerful strategy involves something surprisingly simple: changing your state through action. When you feel low, your body often becomes still. You sit longer, move less, and your world shrinks into the space immediately around you. But your brain and body are in constant conversation. When your body changes state, your mind often follows. This doesn't require heroic levels of motivation. In fact, bad days are usually the worst time to expect heroic motivation. Instead, the goal is small shifts. Step outside for a few minutes. Move your body. Stretch. Walk around the block. Drink water. These actions may sound almost too simple to matter, yet they send powerful signals to your nervous system that you are not stuck. And then there is something many people overlook on difficult days: lowering the pressure of perfection. When things start going wrong, the brain sometimes doubles down on expectations. You might start telling yourself that despite the chaos of the day, you still need to perform at your absolute best in every area of life. But trying to maintain perfection on a difficult day is a bit like trying to run a marathon with one shoe untied. It's technically possible, but unnecessarily exhausting. Instead, one of the most compassionate things you can do is adjust the standard for the day. Some days are meant for peak productivity. Other days are simply about getting through with patience and care. Both kinds of days are part of a balanced life. And let's also talk about something quietly powerful: moments of micro-recovery. Your brain benefits from small pauses during stressful days. Even a few minutes of stepping away from a problem can help reset your mental state. Take a breath. Look away from the screen. Notice something outside the immediate storm of your thoughts. These moments may seem insignificant, but they allow the nervous system to reset rather than remaining stuck in continuous tension. Humor can also play a surprising role here. On a difficult day, your brain tends to narrow its focus toward everything that's going wrong. But when you allow yourself to laugh, even gently, at the absurdity of the situation, you introduce psychological flexibility. Sometimes the healthiest thought you can have is something like, "Well, this is not exactly how I imagined today going." Because the truth is, life rarely unfolds according to our perfectly organized plans. And finally, one of the most important ideas I want to leave with you is this: a better day doesn't require a perfect ending. Turning a bad day into a better day doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes wonderful. It simply means the emotional direction shifts slightly. Maybe the frustration softens. Maybe you finish one task you thought you couldn't. Maybe you end the day feeling a little calmer than you did in the morning. Those small shifts matter more than you think. Because when you begin to understand how your thoughts, actions, and expectations interact with your emotions, you realize something quietly empowering. Even on difficult days, you are not powerless inside your own mind. You have the ability to pause, adjust, move, breathe, and guide the day in a new direction. And sometimes, that small redirection is enough to transform the entire experience of the day. After exploring how we can turn difficult days into better ones, I want to shift your attention to something surprisingly powerful, yet often overlooked. Many people search for complicated psychological strategies to improve their mental health. They look for life-changing breakthroughs, deep philosophical answers, or dramatic mindset transformations. But here's the fascinating truth: before we search for complex solutions, we must first look at the basic foundations that support the mind and body every single day. Because the human brain, brilliant as it is still deeply connected to the body that carries it around. And sometimes when our mood feels low, when our focus disappears, or when life feels overwhelming, The explanation isn't always buried in deep psychological mysteries. Sometimes the answer is much simpler. Sometimes the mind is struggling because the body is running on empty. So let me invite you to pause for a moment and imagine something. Picture the brain as the control center of a highly sophisticated machine. This machine can solve problems, create ideas, build relationships, and navigate complex emotions. But even the most advanced machine needs the right conditions to function properly. It needs energy, rest, movement, and balance. Yet many of us try to operate this incredible system while quietly ignoring those essentials. For example, let's talk about sleep, the silent architect of mental health. When you sleep well, your brain performs extraordinary work behind the scenes. It organizes memories, processes emotions, repairs neural connections, and restores your ability to think clearly. But when sleep is disrupted, whether from stress, late-night scrolling, or that mysterious moment when you promise yourself just one more episode, your brain begins the next day at a disadvantage. Suddenly, your patience becomes thinner. Your thoughts become heavier. Small problems feel larger than they actually are. And the mind, trying to make sense of this fatigue, may start telling negative stories about your abilities, your future, or your circumstances. But often the issue isn't a character flaw or a personal weakness. Sometimes the brain is simply tired. Now let's turn our attention to another basic foundation: movement. The human body was designed for motion, not endless hours of sitting in chairs, staring at glowing rectangles that demand our attention every few seconds. When you move your body, even in simple ways, your brain receives powerful signals that influence mood, energy, and focus. You don't need extreme workouts or complicated fitness routines. In fact, the mind often responds beautifully to small, consistent movement. A walk outside, stretching your muscles, or simply changing your physical environment can shift your internal state more than you might expect. Your brain begins releasing chemicals that support motivation, reduce stress, and improve emotional balance. It's almost as if your body gently whispers to your mind, "Hey, we're alive, we're moving, and things might actually be okay." Another essential element we often overlook is nutrition and hydration. Your brain is one of the most energy-hungry organs in the body. It requires a steady supply of nutrients and water to maintain focus, emotional stability, and cognitive clarity. When blood sugar crashes or dehydration creeps in, the brain's ability to regulate emotions becomes more difficult. Have you ever noticed how life suddenly feels much more dramatic when you're hungry? Suddenly, every inconvenience feels like a personal challenge from the universe. The traffic light stays red a little too long. Your email inbox grows by 3 messages, and your brain starts reacting as if you're navigating a crisis. And then, almost magically, after eating something, things feel a little more manageable. That's not a coincidence. That's biology. Then there's another fundamental element that quietly supports mental well-being: connection with the outside world. Spending time in natural light, stepping outside, breathing fresh air. These experiences send powerful signals to your nervous system. Sunlight helps regulate your internal clock, supporting better sleep and improved mood. And yet modern life often traps us indoors under artificial lighting, moving between screens, schedules, and responsibilities. Sometimes the mind simply needs a reminder that the world outside still exists. But perhaps the most important message I want you to take from this moment is this: caring for your mental health doesn't always require heroic effort. Often it begins with respecting the basics that keep your brain and body functioning as a unified system. Sleep, movement, nourishment, light, rest. These are not luxuries. They are psychological foundations. And here's the subtle humor of being human. We often ignore these simple elements while searching for complicated answers. We read productivity strategies, download mindfulness apps, and listen to long motivational speeches, all while quietly forgetting to drink water or go to bed on time. Your brain deserves better than that. So as I continue guiding you through this exploration of the mind, I invite you to treat these foundations not as chores, but as acts of self-respect. Each time you care for your body, you are also supporting your emotional resilience, your clarity of thought, and your ability to navigate life's inevitable challenges. Because when the basics are in place, your mind becomes far more capable of handling everything else. And sometimes the most powerful step toward a stronger, calmer mind is simply remembering to take care of the human being who lives inside it. The journey through low moods and tangled emotions naturally leads us to a deeper question, one that quietly waits beneath every struggle. Why do we move forward at all? When the mind is heavy, when negative thoughts whisper that effort is pointless, when the body feels slow and the future uncertain, motivation can seem like a mysterious force that visits some people and abandons others. Yet the truth is far less mysterious and far more hopeful. Motivation is not a magical spark reserved for the lucky. It is something shaped by the way our mind, body, and actions interact with each other. When we understand this relationship, the fog around our lack of motivation begins to clear, and what once felt like personal failure begins to look more like a pattern that can be gently shifted. And once we start to see motivation in this way, something remarkable happens. We realize that waiting to feel motivated before acting is often the very thing keeping us stuck. Many people imagine motivation as the engine that must start before the vehicle moves. They sit on the edge of change thinking, when I feel ready, then I'll begin. But the psychology of human behavior reveals a different sequence entirely. Action often comes first, and motivation quietly grows behind it. When a person takes even the smallest step, getting out of bed when the mind insists on hiding, taking a short walk when the body feels heavy, opening a notebook when the mind says there is no point, the brain begins to register a shift. Signals travel through the body, movement, progress, possibility. And from those signals, motivation slowly awakens. This is why the absence of activity can quietly deepen emotional pain. When difficult emotions like grief, anxiety, or self-doubt appear, the natural instinct is to withdraw. We avoid the tasks that once gave our lives structure. We postpone the phone call, skip the exercise, close the book, cancel the plan. At first it feels like relief, like a moment of rest from the pressure of living. But slowly, almost invisibly, that withdrawal begins to build a downward spiral. Less activity means fewer experiences of progress, fewer moments of connection, fewer reminders that we are capable of shaping our own lives. And the brain, always searching for meaning in the signals it receives, interprets this quiet inactivity as evidence that nothing is worth doing. Motivation fades not because we are weak, but because the system feeding it has been switched off. Yet hidden within this spiral is also the way out. The mind does not require grand heroic efforts to begin shifting direction. In fact, the most powerful changes often begin with movements so small they almost feel insignificant. A 5-minute task, a single page, a brief conversation, a short walk under the open sky. Each small action sends a message through the nervous system that life is still moving, that effort still leads somewhere. Over time, those tiny signals accumulate, forming a new pattern in the brain. What once felt impossible begins to feel slightly manageable, then familiar, and eventually natural. Motivation, in this sense, is less like lightning and more like a muscle that strengthens each time we choose action over avoidance. As this understanding settles in, another gentle truth emerges. Motivation is deeply connected to meaning. When actions are tied only to pressure, obligation, or the fear of failure, the mind resists them with quiet rebellion. But when those same actions are connected to something that matters, a personal value, a vision of the person we want to become, the kind of life we want to slowly build, they begin to feel different. The effort is still there. The difficulty does not magically disappear, but beneath the struggle there is direction. The mind can endure a surprising amount of discomfort when it senses that the path ahead leads somewhere meaningful. And perhaps this is where the real shift begins to take place. Instead of asking the exhausting question, how do I force myself to feel motivated? We begin asking something far more powerful. What small action would move me one step closer to the life I care about? That question changes the relationship we have with effort. It replaces pressure with curiosity, self-criticism with quiet experimentation. Every action becomes a message to the brain that life is still unfolding, that the story is still being written, that the future has not yet decided who we are going to become. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the heavy stillness begins to soften. The mind that once believed it was trapped starts to notice movement again. And somewhere in that movement, in those small, repeated choices to step forward even without certainty, motivation begins to rise. Not as a loud, dramatic force, but as a quiet companion walking beside us, reminding us that the path of a meaningful life is rarely built by waiting for the perfect feeling, but by continuing to move, gently and courageously, through the imperfect moments that make us human. Once you begin to understand that motivation is not some magical lightning bolt that strikes only the lucky, another quieter question starts to rise from within the mind. If motivation can grow, then how do we nurture it when life feels heavy, when the days blur together, when the mind whispers that nothing is worth the effort? Because the strange truth about motivation is that it behaves less like a switch and more like a fragile flame, something that cannot simply be turned on, but can be protected, fed, and slowly strengthened until it begins to glow on its own. Most people spend years believing that motivation must arrive first, that one day they will wake up feeling energized, inspired, ready to change everything. Yet real life rarely unfolds that way. Instead, motivation often hides quietly behind the smallest movements forward, waiting for proof that we are willing to step toward life even when the emotional weather inside us feels cloudy. And this is where the story of motivation becomes deeply human, because every mind knows the sensation of standing still in front of something important while a storm of thoughts swirls around it. I'm too tired. I'll start tomorrow. What if I fail? What if it doesn't matter anyway? These thoughts feel convincing not because they are true, but because the brain is designed to conserve energy and avoid discomfort. From the brain's perspective, staying still feels safe, predictable, efficient. But the deeper part of us, the part that longs to grow, to explore, to build a meaningful life, knows that safety alone is not enough to make a life feel alive. So motivation begins its quiet work not in moments of certainty, but in moments of gentle rebellion against that inner resistance. That rebellion rarely looks dramatic. It often begins in almost invisible ways. A person who feels lost opens a book for just 5 minutes. Someone burdened by grief steps outside and notices the cool air against their skin. A student overwhelmed by anxiety writes the first imperfect sentence of an assignment. These tiny acts might appear insignificant from the outside, but inside the brain they are powerful signals. They tell the nervous system that movement is still possible, that effort still exists, that the story is not over yet. And slowly, almost invisibly, Motivation begins to grow behind those actions like roots spreading beneath the surface of the soil. As those roots deepen, something else starts to change: the way we relate to progress itself. Many people unknowingly sabotage their motivation because they expect transformation to feel exciting and immediate, but growth rarely arrives with fireworks. It feels quiet, repetitive, sometimes even boring. The mind practices showing up again and again, long before it begins to feel rewarding. Yet this is exactly how the brain builds new patterns. Each time a person repeats a small positive action, getting up at the same time, finishing a task they once avoided, reaching out to someone instead of isolating, the brain lays down a slightly stronger pathway. What once required enormous effort begins to feel slightly easier. And that ease is the beginning of real motivation. But nurturing motivation is not only about action, it is also about meaning. Because human beings are not machines driven purely by discipline, we are storytellers by nature. We move more willingly when we feel connected to a purpose larger than the discomfort of the present moment. When the mind remembers why something matters, why learning matters, why healing matters, why building a life matters even after pain, effort begins to feel different. The same task that once felt heavy suddenly carries a quiet sense of direction. And direction has a powerful effect on motivation because it transforms struggle from something pointless into something meaningful. This is why people often discover that the most sustainable motivation grows from their values rather than their moods. Moods change like weather, shifting from sunshine to storm without warning. But values remain like the mountains beneath the clouds. A person who values growth will keep learning even on days when confidence is low. Someone who values connection will reach out even when anxiety whispers to stay hidden. Someone who values purpose will continue building their life one small brick at a time, even when the road ahead looks uncertain. And as this understanding slowly settles into the mind, motivation begins to feel less like a rare emotional high and more like a quiet relationship we develop with ourselves. It becomes the practice of showing up imperfectly, forgiving the days when we stumble, and returning again with curiosity instead of self-criticism. Because motivation does not grow in an environment of harsh judgment. It grows in the presence of patience, kindness, and the belief that progress, even slow progress, is still progress. Over time, the person who once believed they had no motivation at all begins to notice something surprising. The small steps are no longer quite as difficult. The mind still produces doubts, fears, and anxious predictions, but they no longer carry the same authority. Action has become familiar. Movement has become natural. And somewhere along that quiet journey, motivation, once fragile and uncertain, has transformed into something steady, something alive, something that continues to glow softly within, guiding each step forward through the unpredictable, mysterious, beautifully unfinished path of being human. Once motivation begins to flicker back into life, even if only faintly, another question inevitably appears in the quiet spaces of the mind, a question that every human being has asked themselves at some point while staring at an unfinished task, a difficult responsibility, or a new beginning that feels heavier than expected. What do you do when the mind simply refuses to cooperate? When you know what needs to be done, yet every part of you feels like turning away from it? Because there are moments in life when the distance between intention and action feels enormous, as if an invisible wall has appeared between who we are and who we want to become. And strangely, that wall is rarely built from laziness. It is built from emotion. Sometimes it is fear quietly whispering that failure will hurt too much. Sometimes it is grief draining the energy from even the smallest efforts. Sometimes it is anxiety painting the task ahead as something far more dangerous than it truly is. And sometimes it is simply the weight of exhaustion, the mind overwhelmed by too many responsibilities, too many expectations, too many thoughts spinning through the night when the world is silent. In those moments, the brain begins searching for escape routes. It offers distractions, delays, comforting habits that promise relief for now, even if they deepen the struggle later. The phone becomes more interesting. The bed becomes more inviting. The promise of tomorrow becomes strangely convincing. Yet hidden beneath this struggle is a powerful truth about human behavior. Waiting to feel ready is often the very thing that keeps us frozen. Feelings are powerful guides, but they are not always reliable leaders. If every action in life depended on perfect emotional alignment, very little would ever happen. Artists would never begin their first blank page. Students would never start their hardest assignment. People carrying emotional pain would never take the first fragile step toward healing. Life would remain suspended in hesitation. And so the secret to movement begins with something surprisingly simple: shrinking the moment. When a task feels overwhelming, the mind sees the entire mountain instead of the first step. It imagines the hours of effort, the risk of failure, the possibility that the work will not be good enough. But when the task is gently reduced to something almost laughably small, the brain relaxes its resistance. Instead of finish the project, it becomes open the document. Instead of fix your entire life, it becomes stand up and take a breath. Instead of exercise for an hour, it becomes walk to the end of the street. These tiny acts slip past the mind's alarm system, and once the movement begins, something unexpected happens. Momentum awakens, and momentum has a quiet magic to it. Action generates energy in a way that thinking alone never can. The body shifts. The mind notices progress. The emotional fog thins just enough for the next step to appear. What once felt impossible begins to feel manageable, not because the challenge disappeared, but because movement has replaced paralysis. But there is another deeper shift that transforms the way we approach these moments. Instead of asking ourselves, "Do I feel like doing this?" we begin asking a different question altogether. What kind of person do I want to be right now? Because identity has a powerful influence over behavior. A person who sees themselves as someone who shows up, even imperfectly, even reluctantly, begins to act in alignment with that story. Each small action becomes a quiet vote for the person they are becoming. And slowly, through repeated moments like these, the relationship between emotion and action begins to change. Feelings no longer sit in the driver's seat, deciding whether life moves forward or stays still. They ride in the passenger seat instead, acknowledged, respected, but not allowed to steer the direction entirely. Over time, the person who once waited endlessly for motivation begins to discover something unexpected within themselves, a quiet strength that does not depend on mood, a resilience that appears not through dramatic bursts of willpower, but through gentle, consistent choices. And somewhere within those choices, in those moments when you begin despite not feeling ready, you realize something profound. The path forward was never blocked by the absence of motivation. It was simply waiting for the courage of one small step. The moment you realize that one small step can shift the direction of your life, a deeper awareness quietly rises beneath that realization. Because sooner or later, every person reaches a point where the question becomes much bigger than finishing a task or starting a habit. Life itself begins asking for change. Sometimes that change arrives gently, like a quiet whisper telling you that the path you've been walking no longer feels right. Other times it crashes into your world like a sudden storm: loss, heartbreak, burnout, a career that no longer fits, a version of yourself that feels strangely unfamiliar. In those moments, the mind stands at the edge of something vast and uncertain, staring at the horizon of a new life and asking the same fragile question: where do I even begin? Large life changes have a peculiar way of magnifying fear. When the future stretches out in front of you like an unknown landscape, the brain tries to map the entire journey at once. It imagines every risk, every mistake, every possible outcome. The result is overwhelming. The mind spins in endless loops of thinking, planning, worrying, doubting. Days pass, sometimes months, occasionally years, while a person waits for clarity that never quite arrives. Yet clarity is rarely the starting point of transformation. More often, clarity is something that appears later, like a path slowly revealing itself as you walk through the fog. What makes these moments so emotionally heavy is the illusion that big life changes require big, dramatic beginnings. Movies and stories love to show transformation as a bold leap, a sudden decision, a powerful breakthrough, a single moment where everything changes. Real life is quieter than that. Real life tends to shift through small movements that feel almost ordinary at first. A conversation that opens a new perspective, a decision to learn something unfamiliar, a single boundary set where silence once lived. These moments rarely feel heroic in the moment, yet they are often the true starting points of a new direction. Fear naturally tries to protect us from stepping into those moments. The mind whispers familiar doubts. What if I choose the wrong path? What if I fail? What if I regret it? But beneath those fears lies a deeper truth about change. Waiting for certainty is one of the most reliable ways to remain exactly where you are. Human beings are not designed to solve the entire puzzle of their lives before taking action. We are designed to discover our path through movement, through experimentation, through curiosity. Consider how a traveler moves through unfamiliar terrain at night. They cannot see the entire road ahead. The darkness hides most of the journey. Yet the traveler carries a small lantern, and that lantern only illuminates a few steps in front of them. Those few steps are enough. Each step forward reveals the next piece of ground, and the path slowly unfolds. Big life changes work in much the same way. You do not need to see the entire future to begin. You only need enough courage to take the next visible step. Meaningful change also asks for patience with the emotional waves that come with it. Excitement and doubt often travel together. Hope and grief can exist in the same moment. Leaving an old version of your life behind, even when it is necessary, can still feel like loss. The brain clings to familiarity because it feels safe, even when that familiarity is quietly draining your energy or dimming your sense of purpose. Recognizing this emotional complexity is part of the journey. Change does not require the absence of fear. It simply requires the willingness to move with fear sitting beside you. Gradually, something remarkable begins to happen. Each step, no matter how small, sends a signal back to your mind. I am capable of moving forward. Confidence grows not from perfect decisions, but from lived experience, from discovering that you can adapt, learn, and adjust as life unfolds. The once intimidating landscape of change begins to feel less like a terrifying void and more like an open field of possibility. Eventually, the person who once stood frozen at the edge of transformation begins to realize something quietly powerful. The starting point was never hidden somewhere far away in the future. It was always here, waiting in the present moment, in the simple act of choosing one direction over stillness, one step over hesitation, one quiet movement toward the life that has been patiently waiting for you to begin walking toward it. The moment you begin stepping toward change, even in the smallest ways, something curious often happens inside the mind. The same mind that once begged for movement suddenly whispers a different request, one that feels deeply human and strangely universal. It says, "Can't this just disappear? Can't the fear fade, the grief soften, the anxiety fall silent so life can finally feel simple again?" There is a quiet longing within all of us to press an invisible button that makes the heavy emotions vanish, to wake up one morning and find that the storm inside the chest has cleared overnight, leaving behind calm skies and effortless breathing. That desire is not weakness. It is the nervous system searching for relief. Emotional pain, stress, and uncertainty place enormous pressure on the mind and body. The brain is built to detect discomfort and remove it as quickly as possible. When sadness lingers too long, when anxiety buzzes through the chest like restless electricity, when regret or shame echoes through our thoughts late at night, the instinct is immediate and powerful. Escape it, silence it, make it all go away. Many of the habits that slowly pull people into downward spirals begin in this very place. The mind discovers quick exits, distraction, avoidance, endless scrolling, numbing routines, staying busy enough to outrun uncomfortable thoughts. For a moment, these strategies work. The feeling softens, the mind breathes easier, the storm quiets just enough to get through the day. Yet emotions rarely disappear simply because we push them away. They wait quietly beneath the surface, gathering strength, returning in new shapes when the distractions fade. This is one of the great paradoxes of the human mind. The harder we try to eliminate certain emotions, the louder they often become. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater. For a few seconds you might succeed, pressing it down with all your strength, but the moment your grip loosens, it bursts back to the surface with even more force. Difficult emotions behave in much the same way. The more energy we spend fighting them, the more they demand attention. A different kind of strength begins to emerge when a person stops treating emotions like enemies that must be defeated. Instead, they become signals, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes confusing, but always carrying information about what the mind and body are experiencing. Fear may be pointing towards something important that matters deeply. Sadness may be acknowledging a loss that deserves recognition. Anxiety may be trying to protect us from uncertainty, even if its alarm system is slightly too sensitive. Learning to sit beside these emotions, rather than chasing them away, can feel unsettling at first. The silence created when we stop distracting ourselves can seem louder than the noise we try to escape. Yet within that silence there is space for something new. Curiosity replaces resistance. Compassion begins to replace criticism. The mind slowly realizes that emotions are not permanent residents. They are passing weather systems moving through the landscape of our inner world. When we allow those emotional waves to rise and fall naturally, something unexpected happens. They begin to lose their intensity. The storm that once felt overwhelming reveals moments of calm between the clouds. The thoughts that once felt like undeniable truths start to look more like temporary stories the brain tells while trying to make sense of complex feelings. From that place of acceptance, real change becomes possible. Instead of spending energy trying to erase emotional pain, we begin using that energy to build a life that can hold those emotions without collapsing under their weight. We create routines that anchor us. We reach toward people who understand. We move our bodies, step into fresh air, let the rhythm of living slowly restore balance to the nervous system. Gradually, the urgent desire to make everything disappear softens into a quieter understanding. Life was never meant to be free from discomfort. It was meant to be rich enough, meaningful enough, connected enough that even difficult emotions become part of the story rather than the end of it. And somewhere in that realization, In the gentle moment when you stop fighting the waves and begin floating with them instead, the mind discovers a surprising kind of peace. Not because every problem has vanished, but because you have learned that you can remain steady even while the tide continues to move. The quiet peace that begins to appear when we stop fighting our emotions often leads to a new and slightly puzzling realization, because once the struggle to push feelings away begins to soften, another question rises gently to the surface of awareness. If emotions are not enemies to eliminate, then what exactly are we supposed to do with them? Most of us were never taught how to live alongside our emotions. We were taught how to hide them, suppress them, outrun them, or sometimes drown them in distraction. Somewhere along the way, many people absorbed the belief that difficult emotions are problems that must be solved immediately. Yet emotions are not puzzles waiting for a perfect answer. They are experiences moving through the body, temporary messengers passing through the landscape of our mind. This becomes clearer when you notice how emotions actually behave. They arrive quickly, often without invitation, triggered by memories, expectations, fears, hopes, or events unfolding around us. A sudden wave of anxiety before speaking in front of others. A quiet sadness that appears when a familiar song plays unexpectedly. A sharp burst of frustration when something small goes wrong after a long, exhausting day. These reactions feel powerful because they involve the entire nervous system. The heart beats faster, the muscles tighten, thoughts race through the mind searching for explanations. It can feel as though the emotion itself has taken control of the story. What changes everything is the moment a person begins to recognize that emotions are signals rather than commands. They are information, not instructions. Fear may appear in the body, yet fear does not automatically mean danger. Anger may flare up, yet anger does not require destruction. Sadness may sit quietly in the chest without meaning that hope has disappeared. The mind has the remarkable ability to observe what it feels without becoming completely defined by it. This small distance between emotion and reaction becomes one of the most powerful tools for navigating the inner world. Learning to pause inside that space can feel unfamiliar at first. The brain is used to reacting quickly, jumping from emotion straight into action or avoidance. But when we slow down for even a few seconds, something fascinating begins to happen. Instead of being swept away by the emotional current, we start to witness it. The breath deepens slightly. The mind notices the physical sensations of the emotion moving through the body. Anxiety may feel like a tight flutter in the stomach. Anger may feel like heat rising through the chest. Grief may feel like heaviness settling behind the eyes. Observing emotions this way does not make them disappear instantly, but it changes our relationship with them. They become waves instead of storms. Waves rise, crest, and eventually fall. No emotional state, no matter how intense, remains frozen forever. The nervous system naturally seeks balance, constantly adjusting and recalibrating if we allow the process to unfold without resistance. Another quiet transformation begins when we allow ourselves to respond to emotions with curiosity instead of judgment. Rather than saying, "Why am I like this?" the question becomes, "What might this feeling be trying to show me?" Sometimes the answer reveals an unmet need: rest, connection, understanding. Sometimes it highlights a value that matters deeply, something worth protecting or pursuing. At other times, there may be no clear explanation at all, and the emotion simply passes like a cloud drifting across the sky. What matters most is the growing awareness that emotions are not obstacles on the path to a meaningful life. They are part of the path itself. Every moment of joy, fear, love, grief, excitement, or doubt is evidence that the mind is alive, responding to the world with depth and sensitivity. The goal is not to eliminate these experiences, but to develop the resilience to move through them without losing ourselves in the process. Gradually, the emotional landscape becomes less intimidating. Feelings still arrive, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes intensely, but they no longer carry the same sense of chaos. They are simply visitors, each one offering a glimpse into the deeper layers of being human. And within that growing understanding, a gentle confidence begins to settle in the heart, the quiet knowledge that whatever emotions arise, you have the capacity to meet them, breathe through them, and continue walking forward through the unfolding story of your life. That quiet confidence that begins to grow when we learn to face our emotions naturally leads us to something many people overlook, something so ordinary that its influence is often invisible. The words we use. Not just the words spoken to others, but the ones whispered silently inside our own minds every day. Because long before we take action, long before habits form or decisions unfold, there is usually a sentence running through our thoughts, narrating what is happening and what it means about who we are. For many people, that inner narration can be surprisingly harsh. The mind becomes a relentless commentator, describing mistakes with brutal honesty and achievements with quiet dismissal. A small failure becomes "I'm useless at this." A difficult day becomes "I can't handle anything." An uncertain future becomes "I'm probably going to mess this up anyway." The brain listens carefully to these statements, because language is one of its most powerful organizing tools. Words shape meaning, meaning shapes emotion, and emotion quietly influences the direction of behavior. Consider how the body reacts to a simple phrase like "I can't cope." The shoulders tighten, the breath becomes shallow, the mind begins searching for evidence that supports the statement. Soon the world looks heavier, the challenges appear larger, and the motivation to try begins to shrink. Yet the fascinating part of this process is that the brain does not perfectly distinguish between objective truth and repeated suggestion. The sentences we repeat often enough begin to feel real, even when they started as fleeting thoughts born from a moment of stress or self-doubt. Once this realization settles in, something extraordinary becomes possible. The same language that quietly dragged the mind downward can also guide it toward resilience. Harnessing the power of words does not mean pretending everything is perfect or forcing artificial positivity. The mind is too intelligent for that kind of illusion. Instead, it means choosing language that is honest yet empowering, words that acknowledge difficulty while leaving space for possibility. A small shift in phrasing can change the emotional landscape entirely. "I can't do this" becomes "This is hard, but I can learn." "I always fail" transforms into "I'm still figuring this out." The challenge remains real, but the story surrounding it opens rather than closes. The brain hears the difference immediately. Instead of searching for proof of defeat, it begins scanning for ways forward. Language also shapes how we experience our emotions. When anxiety arrives, many people instinctively label themselves with it. "I am anxious." That sentence sounds harmless, yet it fuses identity with a temporary state. A different phrasing creates distance. "I notice anxiety right now." Suddenly, the feeling becomes something passing through rather than something that defines who you are. This subtle shift gives the mind breathing room, reminding it that emotions move and evolve rather than permanently attaching themselves to our identity. The power of words extends beyond the private space of thought. Conversations with others also act as mirrors, reflecting the narratives we carry about ourselves. When we describe our lives as endless struggles or constant failures, those descriptions begin shaping how we interpret future events. When we speak about growth, curiosity, or resilience, even in the presence of challenges, the brain slowly begins organizing experiences around those themes. Over time, the language we choose becomes a kind of architecture for the mind. Each sentence lays down a small structure that supports the way we see the world. Encouraging words build pathways toward courage and experimentation. Gentle self-talk creates room for recovery after mistakes. Honest but hopeful language transforms setbacks into chapters of learning rather than proof of inadequacy. Eventually, the inner voice that once echoed with doubt begins to sound different. Not unrealistically cheerful, not blindly optimistic, but steady, grounded, and supportive. A voice that says, "This moment is difficult, but it is not the end of the story." And within that quiet sentence lies something powerful enough to shift the direction of a life. The simple, profound realization that the way we speak to ourselves can become the compass guiding us through uncertainty toward a more meaningful and compassionate way of being. That steady inner voice we begin to build through our words does something interesting over time. It does not only change the way we treat ourselves, it also changes the way we see the people around us. Because once you learn how powerful emotions can be inside your own mind, the quiet storms of doubt, the sudden waves of anxiety, the heavy silence of grief, you start recognizing those same invisible battles in others. A friend who suddenly withdraws, a colleague who seems unusually irritable, a family member whose laughter has slowly faded into something quieter. Human beings carry entire emotional worlds behind their expressions, and most of the time those worlds remain hidden in plain sight. This is where one of the most meaningful roles we can play in another person's life begins to reveal itself. Supporting someone is not about having perfect advice or magical solutions that erase their pain. In fact, the urge to fix everything often comes from our own discomfort with seeing someone we care about struggle. We rush toward answers because we want relief for them, and perhaps for ourselves too. Yet emotional pain rarely disappears simply because someone offers the right sentence or clever explanation. What people often need most in those moments is something far simpler and far more powerful. The feeling that they are not alone inside what they are experiencing. Imagine sitting beside someone who is carrying a heavy burden. Their thoughts are tangled, their emotions loud and confusing. Advice thrown too quickly into that space can sometimes feel like pressure rather than support. But quiet presence has a different effect. When someone listens with patience, without rushing to correct or dismiss the emotion being expressed, the nervous system begins to settle. The brain recognizes a signal of safety. The person speaking feels seen rather than judged, understood rather than analyzed. Listening in this way requires a kind of gentle curiosity. Instead of assuming we already know what the other person needs, we create space for their story to unfold at its own pace. Questions become invitations rather than interrogations. Simple responses. "That sounds really hard. I'm glad you told me. I'm here with you," can hold more comfort than long explanations ever could. These words do not attempt to erase the emotion. They acknowledge it, allowing the person to breathe within their experience rather than fight it alone. There is also a quiet strength in resisting the urge to minimize someone's feelings. When someone says they feel overwhelmed, phrases like "it's not that bad" or "you'll get over it" may be meant as encouragement, yet they often close the door on deeper connection. Emotions are deeply personal landscapes. What feels manageable to one person might feel enormous to another. Respecting that difference creates an atmosphere where honesty can grow. Supporting someone also means remembering that we cannot carry their entire journey for them. Compassion does not require sacrificing our own emotional balance. Healthy support involves boundaries that protect both people. Sometimes the most loving response includes encouraging someone to seek additional help, to speak with a professional, or to explore tools that extend beyond what friendship alone can provide. When support is offered in this balanced way, presence without pressure, empathy without control, it creates something remarkable. The person struggling begins to rediscover their own strength, not because someone solved their problems, but because someone stood beside them long enough for their inner resilience to reappear. Over time, these quiet moments of connection ripple outward through lives in ways that are difficult to measure. A conversation that made someone feel understood. A silence shared without judgment. A reminder that vulnerability does not have to be faced in isolation. Somewhere within those simple acts of listening and kindness, life reveals one of its gentlest truths. Healing rarely happens in complete solitude. It often unfolds in the presence of another human being who is willing to sit beside the storm without trying to control the weather, offering nothing more and nothing less than steady companionship as the clouds slowly begin to move. That steady companionship we offer others during their emotional storms often brings us face to face with one of the most profound human experiences of all: grief. It is the quiet visitor that arrives when something meaningful leaves our lives. Sometimes a person we loved deeply, sometimes a dream we once believed would shape our future, sometimes a version of ourselves that no longer exists. Loss rarely announces itself gently. It can arrive like a sudden crack in the foundation of life, leaving the world strangely unfamiliar, as if the colors have faded slightly and the air itself has grown heavier. Grief has a way of disorienting the mind. One moment you may feel calm, almost normal, and the next moment a memory appears without warning. A smell, a place, a song, a photograph, and suddenly emotion rises through the chest like a wave breaking against the shore. Many people are surprised by how unpredictable grief can be. Society often suggests that healing should follow a clear path, a tidy timeline where sadness gradually fades until everything feels resolved. Yet the emotional reality is far more complex. Grief does not move in straight lines. It circles, pauses, surges forward, retreats, then returns again when we least expect it. Part of what makes grief so challenging is the mind's instinct to search for logic in something that rarely follows logic at all. Questions echo through quiet moments. Why did this happen? Could I have done something differently? Will this pain ever stop? The brain wants a clear explanation because explanations offer a sense of control. Yet loss often exists outside the boundaries of reason. Some experiences simply arrive in our lives without neat answers, leaving us to navigate feelings that seem far too large for language. In those moments, it can be tempting to push grief away, to hide from it, to keep busy enough that the silence never becomes loud enough for the pain to speak. Distraction can help us survive the early shock of loss. But emotions that are constantly avoided rarely disappear. They wait patiently beneath the surface. Grief, in particular, carries a quiet persistence because it is deeply connected to love. Where love once existed, grief often follows. It is not a sign of weakness or failure to move on. It is evidence that something mattered profoundly. Understanding grief begins with allowing it to exist without demanding that it behave neatly. Some days it may appear as tears. Other days it may show up as exhaustion, irritability, or a strange numbness where emotions seem distant. Occasionally, it even reveals itself through moments of unexpected laughter when a beautiful memory breaks through the sadness. None of these responses are wrong. They are the mind's natural attempts to process a change that feels almost too large to comprehend. Slowly, over time, grief begins to transform rather than disappear. The raw intensity softens. Memories that once triggered overwhelming sadness begin to carry warmth as well. The relationship we had with what was lost does not vanish. It simply changes shape. Instead of living beside us in the physical world, it becomes part of the inner landscape we carry through life. This transformation happens quietly, often so gradually that we barely notice it at first. One day you realize the pain is not quite as sharp as it once was. A memory brings more gratitude than heartbreak. The mind begins making space for new experiences without feeling as though it has betrayed the past. Somewhere within that slow shift lies one of grief's most surprising gifts. Loss has a way of reminding us how deeply we are capable of caring, how powerful human connection can be, how precious ordinary moments truly are. The pain does not vanish entirely, yet it becomes woven into the story of who we are, proof that we lived, loved, and felt the fragile beauty of being human. And as life continues unfolding around that quiet understanding, grief settles into something gentler, something more reflective, like a distant echo of love that never fully leaves, but slowly becomes part of the quiet strength that carries us forward. That quiet echo of love that grief leaves behind often brings another realization slowly into focus. When people try to understand their pain, they often hear about the so-called stages of grief, almost as if loss were a staircase the heart must climb one step at a time before reaching peace. The idea sounds comforting at first. If grief follows a clear path, then perhaps the mind can measure progress. Perhaps there is a predictable destination waiting at the end. Yet the emotional landscape of loss rarely behaves like a straight staircase. It feels more like walking through a vast terrain where weather shifts without warning, sunlight appearing briefly through clouds before rain returns again. Many people encounter denial early in that terrain, though it does not always appear as a dramatic refusal to accept reality. Often it is quieter, more subtle. The mind protects itself by softening the impact of the truth. For a while, life can feel strangely normal, as if the loss exists somewhere just outside the room rather than inside the heart. Moments arrive when the brain forgets for a split second, reaching for the phone to call someone who is no longer there, or expecting a familiar voice that will never return. Denial in this sense is not deception. It is the nervous system giving itself time to absorb something too large to process all at once. Eventually, the emotional fog begins to lift, and other feelings step forward. Anger sometimes emerges, sharp and surprising. It may aim itself at circumstances, at fate, at other people, even at the person who has been lost. This anger can feel uncomfortable because society often tells us that grief should look gentle and dignified. Yet anger is a natural response to the sense of injustice that loss can create. When something meaningful disappears from our lives, the mind protests. It searches for someone or something to hold responsible for the disruption. As the heart continues navigating this inner landscape, another emotional current may appear: bargaining. Thoughts drift through the mind like quiet negotiations with the past. If only I had done this differently. What if I had said one more thing? Maybe things could have changed somehow. These reflections reveal the mind's deep desire to rewrite the ending of the story, to imagine alternate timelines where the pain never happened. Bargaining is the imagination trying to reclaim control over a moment that felt uncontrollable. Then comes the heavy stillness that many people recognize as sadness, sometimes deep enough to resemble depression. Energy fades. Motivation becomes fragile. Activities that once felt easy now require effort. This stage can feel frightening because the mind worries it might remain trapped there forever. Yet sadness is not a permanent residence. It is the emotional system honoring the significance of what has been lost. The depth of the feeling reflects the depth of the connection that once existed. Somewhere within this slow emotional movement, acceptance begins to appear, not as a sudden feeling of happiness or closure, but as a quiet understanding that life continues to unfold even after loss. Acceptance does not erase the past. It simply allows the present to breathe again. Memories remain, sometimes bittersweet, sometimes warm enough to bring gentle smiles where tears once lived. Still, these emotional states do not line up neatly in a single direction. A person may feel acceptance one week and anger the next, laughter one moment and sorrow the next. Grief flows like a river with many currents, doubling back on itself, deepening, then gradually widening as life grows around it. With time, the landscape changes in subtle ways. The emotions that once felt overwhelming begin to coexist with moments of peace. Love remains woven into memory, shaping the way we see the world and the way we care for others. Loss becomes part of the story rather than the entire story. Eventually, the heart realizes something quietly profound. Healing does not mean leaving grief behind. It means learning how to carry it gently, allowing the love that created the grief to continue guiding the way forward through life's unfolding journey. Learning to carry grief gently often leads to a deeper realization about healing itself, because once the storm of emotions begins to soften, a quiet question starts to appear in the mind. What does it actually mean to move forward after loss? Not in the dramatic sense that movies portray, where a character suddenly declares they are healed and life instantly becomes bright again, but in the quiet, ordinary rhythm of real life, where the heart must slowly learn how to exist in a world that has permanently changed. Mourning, in its truest sense, is not a single moment of acceptance. It is a series of inner tasks the mind and heart gradually work through as they reshape life around what has been lost. The first of these tasks begins with something that sounds simple yet can feel incredibly difficult: acknowledging the reality of the loss. When someone or something meaningful disappears from our lives, the mind instinctively resists the finality of it. Memories feel so vivid that the absence can seem unreal. A familiar chair sits empty. A voice is missing from a conversation. A routine that once felt automatic suddenly dissolves into silence. Part of mourning involves allowing the mind to fully recognize that the world has changed. This recognition does not arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, through small moments when the brain gently accepts what the heart already feels. As this awareness deepens, another task quietly emerges, allowing the pain of grief to be felt rather than constantly avoided. Emotional pain often carries a reputation as something dangerous, something that must be escaped as quickly as possible. Yet when grief is continually pushed aside, it tends to linger beneath the surface, waiting patiently for moments of quiet to return. Mourning invites us to sit with those emotions in manageable doses. Tears may come unexpectedly, memories may feel sharp for a while, and the body may grow tired from the emotional weight. None of these responses are signs of weakness. They are signs that the heart is doing the work of healing. Gradually, the mind begins facing another subtle challenge, adjusting to a life that looks different than it once did. When loss occurs, it does not simply remove a person or experience from our world. It reshapes routines, relationships, and even the way we understand ourselves. Someone who once played a certain role in our life may have been a source of comfort, guidance, or identity. Without that presence, the mind must slowly rediscover how to navigate daily life in new ways. This adjustment can feel awkward at first, like learning to walk again on unfamiliar ground. Yet something remarkable begins to develop during this process. As the heart adapts to the changed landscape of life, it starts discovering ways to maintain a meaningful connection with what was lost while still continuing forward. Love does not vanish simply because someone is no longer physically present. Memories become quiet companions. Values that person once embodied may continue guiding decisions. Lessons learned from that relationship may shape the way we care for others in the future. Mourning, then, is not about erasing the past or pretending that the loss no longer matters. It is about weaving the memory of what once existed into the fabric of the life that continues unfolding. The pain softens not because the love fades, but because the mind gradually finds space for both sorrow and gratitude to coexist. Over time, the heart begins to carry the memory with a gentler touch. The ache that once dominated every thought becomes one thread among many in the tapestry of life. Laughter returns in unexpected moments. New connections grow quietly. The world slowly reveals colors that grief once seemed to dim. Somewhere within that gradual unfolding lies the quiet understanding that mourning is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the natural expression of love adapting to a changed world, guiding the heart forward while still honoring the depth of what once meant everything. Carrying grief gently eventually reveals something surprising about the human spirit, because once the heart learns that pain can exist beside love without destroying it, another quiet discovery begins to form beneath the surface of everyday life. Strength, the kind that truly supports a person through difficult seasons, rarely arrives as a sudden burst of courage or a dramatic moment of transformation. Instead, it grows slowly through the small choices people make while navigating uncertainty, loss, fear, and the countless emotional storms that life sends their way. Many imagine strength as the absence of struggle, as if resilient people walk through life untouched by doubt, sadness, or anxiety. Reality tells a different story. Real strength often appears in quieter ways. In the person who wakes up after a sleepless night, filled with worry, and still decides to step into the day. In the student who feels overwhelmed by pressure, yet continues taking small steps forward. In the individual who carries emotional pain, while still choosing kindness toward others. These moments may not look heroic from the outside, but they form the invisible architecture that supports a meaningful life. One of the most powerful supports within that architecture is connection. Human beings are wired for relationships in ways that run deeper than many people realize. When life becomes heavy, the presence of someone who listens without judgment can change the emotional atmosphere entirely. A simple conversation can soften anxiety. A shared laugh can break through layers of stress. And the quiet reassurance of being understood can remind the mind that it does not have to fight every battle alone. Strength often grows strongest where people allow themselves to be seen rather than hiding behind the illusion of self-sufficiency. Another quiet pillar emerges through the relationship a person builds with their own thoughts. The mind can be both a companion and a critic, sometimes offering encouragement, other times whispering harsh judgments that fuel self-doubt. During difficult periods, those inner voices can become especially loud, repeating stories about failure, weakness, or not being good enough. Learning to notice those thoughts without automatically believing them creates a subtle but powerful shift. The moment someone recognizes that thoughts are not commands but mental events passing through awareness, a small gap appears between the voice of doubt and the deeper sense of self. Within that gap, compassion has room to grow. Many people speak to themselves with a harshness they would never use toward a friend. Yet the mind begins to soften when it hears a different tone, one that acknowledges struggle while still offering patience. Self-compassion does not remove challenges from life, but it transforms the way a person walks through them. Instead of feeling like an enemy battling their own mind, they begin to feel like a guide learning how to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Another quiet form of strength reveals itself through purposeful action. Motivation does not always appear before movement begins. Often it follows action rather than leading it. A small walk outside, a short conversation, a moment spent organizing a cluttered space. These simple acts can gently shift the emotional momentum of a day. The brain responds to activity by adjusting mood, releasing energy that was previously locked behind inertia. What once felt impossible becomes slightly more manageable, and that small shift can open the door to another. Over time, these elements, connection, awareness of thoughts, compassion, and small intentional actions, begin weaving together into something steady and reliable. Life will still bring uncertainty. Stress will still visit. Loss and disappointment will still appear in different forms. Yet beneath those changing experiences stands a quiet foundation that grows stronger with every challenge faced. Eventually, a person realizes that resilience was never about becoming unbreakable. It was about discovering that even after being bent by life's winds, the human spirit has an extraordinary ability to rise again, steady itself, and continue moving forward with a deeper understanding of what it truly means to live. That quiet foundation of inner strength eventually meets one of life's most uncomfortable realities, because no matter how carefully we grow, how thoughtfully we live, or how deeply we try to understand ourselves, there will always come moments when someone else looks at us with disappointment, criticism, or disapproval. And in those moments, something ancient inside the human mind wakes up. It is the part of us that longs to belong, the part shaped by thousands of years of survival where acceptance from the group meant safety and rejection meant danger. So when criticism arrives, even in small doses, it can feel far heavier than the words themselves. A comment from a colleague, a judgment from family, a stranger's harsh opinion online. Suddenly the mind begins replaying those words again and again, searching for meaning, searching for proof that maybe we are not enough. That experience is deeply human because the brain is built to notice threats more easily than praise. Compliments often pass through our awareness like light wind through open windows, while criticism lands like a stone in still water, sending ripples through our thoughts for hours or even days. The mind starts constructing stories around it. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm failing. Maybe everyone thinks this way about me. Before long, the voice of self-doubt grows louder than the original criticism itself. Yet something remarkable begins to happen when awareness steps into that moment. When a person pauses long enough to observe the reaction instead of immediately believing it, the emotional storm begins to slow. Criticism, after all, is not a single category. Sometimes it carries useful information, pointing toward a mistake that can help us grow. Other times it reflects someone else's frustration, fear, insecurity, or expectations that were never truly ours to carry. The challenge lies not in eliminating criticism from life, because that is impossible, but in learning how to examine it without letting it define our sense of worth. A quiet shift occurs when we begin separating the message from our identity. Imagine holding criticism in your hands like an object rather than wearing it like a label. You can turn it around, inspect it, decide what part of it holds value and what part belongs to someone else's perspective. Perhaps there is a small lesson hidden inside, a useful adjustment that strengthens your path forward. Or perhaps the comment reveals more about the speaker's inner world than it does about you. Another layer of strength grows when we accept that disapproval is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Often it simply means you are living according to values that do not perfectly match someone else's expectations. Every meaningful life eventually crosses that line. The artist who chooses creativity over stability, the student who follows curiosity instead of pressure, the individual who protects their mental health by setting boundaries. Each of them will encounter moments when others disagree. Disapproval, in those situations, becomes evidence of authenticity rather than failure. Slowly, the emotional grip of criticism begins to loosen. The mind learns to listen without collapsing, to reflect without condemning itself. Confidence grows not from universal approval, but from understanding that your worth cannot be measured by every passing opinion. Some voices deserve attention. Others are simply noise carried by the winds of human judgment. With time, the same heart that once trembled under criticism begins to respond differently. Words that once echoed painfully now pass through awareness with more balance. Growth continues where it is needed. Boundaries appear where they are healthy. The journey forward becomes less about pleasing every observer and more about staying aligned with the deeper values that quietly shape a meaningful life. Somewhere along that path, a realization settles in like calm after a storm. The courage to keep living honestly, even when not everyone approves, may be one of the most powerful forms of strength a person can ever learn to carry. The courage to live honestly, even when not everyone approves, slowly leads the mind toward another powerful discovery, because once a person stops chasing constant approval, a quiet space begins to open inside them. In that space, something fragile yet extraordinary starts to grow. It is the beginning of confidence, not the loud, exaggerated version often portrayed in movies or social media, but a calmer, steadier force that develops beneath the surface of everyday life. Many people believe confidence must arrive before they take action, as if one morning they will wake up feeling completely certain of themselves, fearless and ready for every challenge ahead. Yet life rarely works that way. Confidence almost never appears first. Instead, it grows quietly behind action, following the footsteps of small risks taken in uncertain moments. A person raises their hand in class despite the fear of saying something wrong. Someone shares an idea in a meeting while their heart beats faster than usual. Another person tries something new even though the voice of doubt whispers that they might fail. Those moments rarely feel heroic while they are happening. They often feel uncomfortable, awkward, even slightly terrifying. The mind might race with thoughts about embarrassment or rejection, but something important occurs when the action is taken anyway. The brain gathers new evidence. It begins to learn that fear does not always lead to disaster. It learns that mistakes are survivable. With every small step, the internal story about what is possible starts to change. Slowly, the relationship with fear begins to shift. Fear does not disappear, because fear is a natural signal designed to protect us. What changes is the meaning we give it. Instead of interpreting nervousness as a warning to stop, the mind starts recognizing it as a signal that something meaningful may be happening just beyond the comfort zone. The pounding heart before speaking, the butterflies before trying something unfamiliar, the uncertainty before making a decision. These sensations become signs that growth might be close. Another quiet transformation happens through the way we interpret setbacks. When confidence is fragile, every mistake can feel like proof of failure. A rejected application, an awkward conversation, a plan that does not work out. Each experience seems to confirm the fear that we are not capable. Yet when the mind begins to see challenges differently, those same moments transform into information rather than judgment. They become part of the learning process, guiding adjustments instead of crushing motivation. Confidence, then, becomes less about perfection and more about trust. It is the growing belief that whatever happens, you will find a way to respond. It is knowing that you can face uncertainty without collapsing under its weight. That trust builds slowly, not through grand achievements alone, but through the countless small decisions to show up for life even when doubt is present. Along the way, something fascinating begins to happen within the inner dialogue. The harsh critic that once dominated every mistake starts losing its authority. In its place, a steadier voice emerges, one that acknowledges difficulty while still encouraging forward movement. The voice might say, "That was uncomfortable, but you tried." Or perhaps, "You can learn from this and try again." Over time, these quiet experiences accumulate like small stones, forming a path across uncertain ground. Each step reinforces the next. Each challenge faced adds another layer of self-trust. Eventually, the person walking that path realizes something deeply liberating. Confidence was never something waiting to be discovered somewhere outside. It was something being built all along. In every moment, they chose to move forward despite the quiet whispers of doubt. The quiet confidence that begins to grow through experience eventually encounters an old shadow that many people carry for years, sometimes without even realizing it. Because once you start moving forward and trying new things, mistakes inevitably appear along the path. A forgotten deadline, a poor decision, a conversation that didn't go as planned, a moment when fear took control and opportunity slipped away. At first, these moments feel small, almost ordinary. Yet the mind has a strange habit of collecting them, stacking them together like evidence in an invisible courtroom where the harshest judge is often the voice inside our own head. That voice can be relentless. It whispers stories that turn mistakes into identities. You failed because you are not capable. You embarrassed yourself because you are not good enough. Over time, those thoughts stop sounding like opinions and start sounding like facts. The memory of the mistake becomes heavier than the lesson it was meant to carry. Many people end up dragging those memories through life like invisible chains, believing the errors of their past somehow define the limits of their future. But something important begins to shift when we slow down and look at mistakes from a different angle. Imagine for a moment the process of learning anything meaningful in life. A child learning to walk falls again and again before finding balance. Someone learning a new language mispronounces words hundreds of times before speaking fluently. An artist fills pages with imperfect sketches before creating something beautiful. In those moments, the mistake is not treated as proof of failure. It is simply part of the process. Somewhere along the way, adulthood quietly changes that perspective. Instead of viewing mistakes as information, the mind starts interpreting them as verdicts about who we are. The brain tries to protect us from embarrassment or rejection by convincing us to avoid situations where mistakes might happen. Ironically, that protection often leads to something far more painful, a life that grows smaller with every fear-driven decision. Yet the truth hiding beneath those experiences is far more freeing. A mistake is an event, not an identity. It is a moment in time where an action produced an outcome we didn't want. That outcome carries information. It teaches us something about the world, about our choices, about the path we might take next time. The moment we separate the event from our sense of self, the weight begins to lift. Consider how differently life feels when mistakes become teachers instead of enemies. The awkward conversation becomes a lesson in communication. The missed opportunity becomes guidance for future courage. The decision that didn't work out becomes valuable experience stored quietly in memory. Instead of shrinking the person, the mistake expands their understanding. This shift also softens the relationship we have with ourselves. The inner critic that once shouted accusations slowly loses its authority. In its place grows a voice that sounds more like a wise companion. That voice might say, "You didn't get that right, but you're still learning." Or perhaps, "This moment does not define your entire story. Gradually, the past begins to feel less like a list of regrets and more like a landscape of lessons. Each misstep reveals something about resilience, adaptability, and the courage it takes to keep trying. The person who once feared mistakes begins to realize that avoiding them was never the goal. What truly shapes a meaningful life is not the absence of errors, but the willingness to continue growing through them, carrying the wisdom they offer while leaving behind the belief that those moments ever had the power to define who you are. Realizing that mistakes do not define who we are opens the door to a deeper and quieter question, one that many people carry silently through their lives without ever speaking aloud. If our past failures are not the measure of our worth, then what is? Somewhere between childhood expectations, social comparisons, and the endless pressure to achieve, many people begin to believe that their value must be constantly proven. It becomes a race with no clear finish line. Achieve more, become better, fix your flaws, improve yourself endlessly. Each accomplishment feels satisfying for a moment, but the feeling fades quickly, replaced by the restless whisper that perhaps it still isn't enough. That whisper is familiar to many minds. It appears in late-night thoughts after a long day of work. It appears when scrolling through the highlight reels of other people's lives. It appears when someone receives praise, yet still feels strangely empty inside. The mind starts building a story that worthiness must be earned through perfection, productivity, or approval. The result is a quiet exhaustion that settles deep into the emotional landscape of everyday life. Yet something remarkable happens when we begin questioning that story. Imagine standing still for a moment, stepping outside the endless race of comparison, and asking a different question entirely. What if worth was never something that needed to be proven in the first place? What if the idea of being enough was not a destination at the end of achievement, but a truth that existed quietly from the beginning? Consider the way we look at others. When a friend struggles, makes a mistake, or feels lost, we rarely conclude that their value as a human being has disappeared. We offer patience. We offer understanding. We remind them that difficult moments do not erase who they are. Yet strangely, the same kindness often disappears when we turn our attention inward. The mind holds itself to standards it would never demand from anyone else. Learning to feel enough begins with noticing that pattern. It starts with recognizing the difference between healthy growth and endless self-criticism. Growth says, I can learn, improve, and evolve. Self-criticism says, I must change because who I am right now is not acceptable. One approach invites curiosity. The other creates shame. A subtle shift occurs when we begin approaching ourselves with the same compassion we offer others. The inner voice softens. Instead of constantly asking, am I good enough yet? It begins asking, what would help me move forward today? That change may seem small, but it transforms the emotional climate inside the mind. Life also begins to feel different when worth is no longer tied exclusively to achievement. Simple moments gain new depth. A quiet walk under an open sky, a genuine conversation with someone who understands you, the small satisfaction of completing a task that once felt overwhelming. These experiences remind us that life is not only about proving ourselves, but also about living fully within the moments that unfold around us. Gradually, the constant pressure to measure up begins to loosen its grip. The person who once felt trapped in the pursuit of validation starts discovering something steadier beneath the surface of daily life. It is the quiet recognition that being human means being imperfect, learning continuously, and still deserving kindness along the way. Within that realization lies a calm strength, the kind that does not need constant approval or flawless performance to survive. The kind that simply exists, steady and present, like a quiet voice in the background of every experience. gently reminding you that long before you achieved anything, long before you proved anything to anyone, you were already enough. Feeling that quiet sense of being enough can be incredibly grounding. Yet even with that understanding, there are moments when the mind suddenly tightens with worry. The chest feels heavier. Thoughts begin racing ahead into uncertain futures, and a familiar wish appears almost automatically inside the heart. I just want this anxiety to disappear. It is a wish shared by millions of people, whispered in silent moments before an important decision, before a difficult conversation, before stepping into unfamiliar territory where outcomes are uncertain. Anxiety can feel like an uninvited storm passing through the mind, shaking confidence, filling the imagination with worst-case scenarios, and convincing us that something terrible might happen at any moment. The strange thing about anxiety is that it was never designed to ruin our lives. Long before modern deadlines, social expectations, and endless digital information, the human brain evolved to protect us from danger. That quick surge of alertness once helped our ancestors notice threats in the wild, react quickly, and survive. The same system still lives inside us today. But instead of reacting to predators or physical threats, it now responds to emails, presentations, exams, relationships, and the complex uncertainties of modern life. The body prepares for danger even when the danger exists only in imagined possibilities. Because of this, the natural instinct is to try to eliminate anxiety completely. People search for ways to silence it, suppress it, escape it. They avoid situations that trigger nervousness, delay decisions that feel uncomfortable, distract themselves endlessly so the feeling never fully surfaces. Yet anxiety has a curious way of growing stronger when we treat it like an enemy. The more the mind insists that it must disappear, the more attention it receives, quietly reinforcing the idea that the sensation itself is dangerous. Something begins to shift when we approach anxiety from a different perspective. Instead of asking how to erase it, we begin asking what it is trying to communicate. Sometimes anxiety simply signals that something matters deeply to us. The nervous energy before an important opportunity often appears because the outcome feels meaningful. The pounding heart before speaking or performing does not necessarily mean failure is coming. It often means the brain is preparing us to focus. In those moments, learning to pause can change everything. When anxiety rises, the body tightens and breathing becomes shallow, which quietly convinces the brain that the threat must be real. Slowing the breath, relaxing the shoulders, grounding attention in the present moment sends a different message through the nervous system. The storm begins to lose its intensity. Thoughts that once rushed uncontrollably begin to slow down, making space for clarity. Another powerful shift happens when we stop believing every anxious thought. The mind under stress tends to imagine extreme outcomes. It leaps into futures that have not happened yet, painting vivid pictures of failure, embarrassment, or disaster. Yet thoughts are not predictions. They are mental events shaped by emotion. Observing them with curiosity rather than fear can weaken their grip. The question quietly changes from what if everything goes wrong to what small step can I take right now? Over time, the relationship with anxiety transforms. It becomes less like a terrifying storm and more like a messenger that occasionally arrives with heightened energy. The feeling may still appear before meaningful challenges, before growth, before moments that stretch us beyond comfort. Yet it no longer dictates every decision. Instead of trying to make anxiety disappear completely, something more powerful happens. The person begins to walk forward even while the sensation exists, discovering along the way that courage is not the absence of anxiety, but the quiet willingness to move through life with an open heart despite the uncertainty that always comes with being alive. Walking forward with anxiety instead of trying to erase it reveals another subtle truth about the mind. Because once we begin noticing how anxiety rises and falls, we also start to see that certain habits quietly feed it, often without us realizing it. The mind is not only shaped by big events or dramatic moments. It is constantly influenced by the small patterns repeated every day. Sometimes those patterns are meant to protect us, yet over time they end up strengthening the very feeling we hope to escape. One of the most common patterns appears when anxiety first whispers a warning and we immediately step away from whatever triggered it. Avoiding the uncomfortable situation feels like relief in the moment. The heart slows down, the tension fades, the mind sighs with temporary comfort. Yet the brain is always learning from experience, and it quietly records that escape as proof that the situation must have been dangerous. The next time the same challenge appears, anxiety arrives even louder, convinced it has saved us before and must do so again. Slowly the world becomes smaller as more situations join the list of things we try not to face. Another pattern unfolds inside the endless loops of thinking. Anxiety often invites the mind into long mental debates about the future. Hours can disappear while imagining every possible outcome, every mistake that might happen, every word that could go wrong in a conversation that has not even occurred yet. This process feels like preparation, but most of the time it simply traps the mind inside a maze of uncertainty. The brain searches for perfect answers to questions that cannot be solved in advance, leaving the body tense and exhausted. The search for reassurance can also become one of anxiety's quiet allies. When the mind feels uncertain, it longs for someone to confirm that everything will be fine. Asking friends, checking messages repeatedly, searching online for signs that nothing bad will happen. These behaviors offer brief comfort, yet reassurance rarely lasts. The moment it fades, the mind returns with another question, another doubt, another need for certainty. What began as a small attempt to calm the mind slowly grows into a cycle where peace depends on constant external confirmation. There are also moments when anxiety feeds on the way we speak to ourselves. The inner voice becomes strict and unforgiving, warning that mistakes would be unbearable, that embarrassment would be catastrophic, that failure would define us forever. Under that kind of pressure, even ordinary challenges begin to feel enormous. The body responds as if facing a serious threat, even when the situation simply involves learning, growing, or trying something unfamiliar. Something powerful begins to happen when we recognize these patterns with curiosity rather than judgment. The goal is not to criticize ourselves for having them. After all, most of these behaviors developed as attempts to stay safe. Instead, awareness opens the possibility of choosing differently, facing a small fear instead of avoiding it, allowing uncertainty to exist without chasing endless answers, letting anxious thoughts pass through the mind without treating them as urgent commands. With each small change, the nervous system receives a new message. The world is not as dangerous as it once believed. Situations that once triggered intense worry slowly lose their power. Confidence grows quietly, not because anxiety has disappeared completely, but because the mind has learned it no longer needs to obey every alarm it sends. Over time, the person who once felt controlled by anxiety begins to notice something remarkable. The same mind that once amplified fear is now learning how to create space, breathe through uncertainty, and move forward with a steadier sense of calm, discovering that freedom often begins the moment we stop unknowingly feeding the very storms we hope will pass. Noticing the habits that quietly feed anxiety often leads to another realization. one that appears in the exact moment when worry suddenly rises again and the body reacts before the mind has time to reason with it. The heart beats faster, breathing becomes shallow, thoughts begin rushing through the imagination like a crowd pushing toward an exit, and in that moment the question becomes urgent and simple. How do you calm this storm right now, while it is happening, not later when everything has already passed? The first thing to understand is that anxiety lives as much in the body as it does in the mind. When the brain senses a possible threat, even an imagined one, it sends signals through the nervous system that prepare the body to react. Muscles tighten, breathing shortens, senses sharpen. This response once helped humans run from danger, but in modern life, it often appears during a presentation, a difficult conversation, or a quiet evening when the mind drifts into uncertain futures. Trying to reason your way out of that state rarely works at first because the body is already speaking louder than logic. A small but powerful shift begins with something that feels almost too simple to matter: slowing the breath. When anxiety takes hold, breathing becomes quick and shallow, quietly convincing the brain that danger must still be present. By deliberately slowing the rhythm of each breath, drawing air in gently through the nose, allowing the lungs to expand, then releasing it slowly through the mouth, you send a completely different message through the nervous system. The body starts realizing that perhaps the threat is not as immediate as it believed. Within moments, the tightness in the chest begins to soften. Attention also plays a remarkable role in calming the mind. Anxiety often pulls awareness far into the future, filling the imagination with what might go wrong hours, days, or even years from now. Bringing attention back to the present moment interrupts that spiral. Notice the sensation of your feet touching the ground, the texture of the air on your skin, the sounds surrounding you in the room. These small observations anchor the mind in what is real rather than what is feared. Movement can also shift the emotional landscape surprisingly quickly. Anxiety fills the body with energy meant for action. When that energy has nowhere to go, it circles inside the mind as restless thoughts. A brief walk, stretching the shoulders, stepping outside to feel fresh air. These simple actions allow the body to release the tension that built up during the anxious moment. Another quiet tool lies in the way we speak to ourselves when anxiety appears. Many people react with frustration, telling themselves to stop feeling this way, to get control, to calm down immediately. Yet that internal pressure often adds another layer of stress. A calmer response might sound more like reassurance. A gentle reminder that this feeling, while uncomfortable, is temporary, that the body is reacting in a way it believes is protective, that you have experienced similar moments before and they eventually passed. With practice, these responses begin to work together like steady hands guiding the mind through turbulent water. The breath slows, the body relaxes, thoughts regain clarity. The storm that once felt overwhelming starts to lose its intensity. Eventually, a quiet confidence develops in those moments of calm. Not the belief that anxiety will never return, because it likely will, but the deeper understanding that when it does, you now carry the ability to meet it with patience, presence, and a steady rhythm of breath that reminds the mind it is safe enough to move forward again. Finding ways to calm the body in anxious moments often reveals something even more fascinating about the mind itself. Because once the breath slows and the storm of physical sensations begins to settle, another challenge quietly steps forward. The thoughts remain. They drift through awareness like restless clouds, replaying worries about the future, analyzing conversations that have already passed, inventing possibilities that may never happen. In those moments, many people feel trapped not by the feeling of anxiety itself, but by the relentless stream of thinking that seems impossible to silence. Anxious thoughts have a remarkable talent for sounding convincing. They arrive dressed as warnings, predictions, or urgent problems that must be solved immediately. The mind begins asking endless questions. What if something goes wrong? What if I fail? What if they judge me? Each question leads to another, creating a chain reaction where the imagination moves further away from the present moment. The more attention those thoughts receive, the stronger they appear, until it feels as though the mind itself has turned into an echo chamber of worry. Yet there is a quiet truth about thoughts that many people overlook. A thought is not a command. It is not a prophecy. It is simply an event in the mind, a mental sentence passing through awareness, much like a sound passing through the air. The brain produces thousands of thoughts every day, most of them automatic reflections shaped by memory, emotion, and habit. Anxiety simply highlights the ones related to danger, repeating them louder in an attempt to keep you alert. Understanding this changes the relationship with those thoughts in a subtle but powerful way. Instead of wrestling with them, trying to argue them away or prove them wrong, you can begin by simply noticing them. Imagine sitting beside a river watching leaves float along the surface of the water. Each leaf represents a thought. Some move quickly, some drift slowly, some circle back before continuing downstream. You do not need to chase them or push them away. You simply watch them pass. This shift in perspective creates space inside the mind. The anxious thought might still appear. What if everything goes wrong tomorrow? But instead of instantly reacting, you notice it as just another leaf on the water. The mind becomes an observer rather than a battlefield. Curiosity replaces urgency. At times, it can also help to gently question the story a thought is telling. Anxiety often deals in extremes. It predicts the worst possible outcome and treats it as inevitable. Asking simple questions can loosen that certainty. Is this thought a fact or a fear? Have I handled difficult situations before? What evidence suggests things might go better than my mind predicts? These questions are not meant to suppress the thought, but to bring balance to the way the mind interprets it. Another powerful response is returning attention to meaningful action. Thoughts about the future rarely resolve themselves through endless analysis. They quiet down when the mind engages with something real, writing a message, taking a step toward a goal, focusing on the task in front of you. Action gently pulls awareness back into the present where life is actually unfolding. Over time, the mind begins learning a new pattern. Anxious thoughts may still appear from time to time because the brain is wired to scan for potential threats. Yet they no longer hold the same authority. They arrive, they pass, and awareness remains steady beneath them. Gradually, the person who once felt overwhelmed by every anxious thought begins to experience something quieter and far more empowering. The realization that the mind can produce storms of worry, but awareness itself remains wide enough to watch those storms move across the sky and eventually fade into calm again. Fear rarely arrives as a loud explosion in the mind. Most of the time it creeps in quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor at sunset, barely noticeable at first, yet slowly taking over the room. After all the struggles we have walked through, the heavy fog of low mood, the exhausting churn of rumination, the ache of self-doubt, another feeling eventually rises from the silence. A deeper, quieter fear, not the fear of a sudden disaster, but the fear of something we already know will come. The inevitable, the passing of time, loss, change, the uncertainty of tomorrow. The knowledge that some things in life cannot be controlled, negotiated with, or avoided. This is the moment when the mind begins to ask the hardest questions. What if everything falls apart? What if I lose what I love? What if the future holds pain I cannot survive? The strange thing about the human mind is that it tries to solve problems even when there is no solution to be found. When we face something inevitable, the brain behaves like a detective trapped in a mystery with no culprit. It keeps searching. It keeps circling the same questions. If I think about it enough, maybe I can stop it. If I worry about it early enough, maybe I can prepare for it. But what actually happens is something far more exhausting. The mind begins building imaginary futures, one darker than the last, rehearsing grief before it has arrived, practicing fear long before there is anything to face. In those moments, the body reacts as if the threat is already here. Heart racing, stomach tightening, breath shortening. Even though the only battlefield exists inside our imagination. Yet beneath this storm of anticipation lies an uncomfortable truth about being human. Some fears cannot be solved because they are woven into life itself. Time will move forward whether we panic or remain calm. People we love will change, and sometimes they will leave. Opportunities will come and go. Bodies will grow older. These are not signs that life is broken. They are signs that life is moving. The mind struggles with this reality because it is built to chase certainty, but certainty is something existence rarely offers. This is where resilience quietly begins to form, not through eliminating fear, but through learning how to stand beside it without letting it drive the story of our lives. When we stop treating fear like an enemy that must be defeated, something unexpected happens. Its voice becomes softer. Instead of screaming warnings about every possible disaster, it becomes information, a signal that something matters deeply to us. Fear of losing someone reveals love. Fear of failure reveals that we care about growth. Fear of the future reveals that we are invested in the life we are building. Gradually, the mind learns a different way to respond. Instead of asking, "How do I stop the inevitable?" a quieter question begins to surface. How do I live well before it arrives? Because the real tragedy is not that life contains loss, uncertainty, or endings. The real tragedy is when fear of those endings prevents us from living the middle chapters fully. When anxiety steals the moments that are actually happening right now. So imagine, for a moment, loosening your grip on the illusion of control. Not giving up on life, but stepping out of that exhausting battle with the future. Notice the strange relief that appears when you allow uncertainty to exist without needing to conquer it. The mind stops running marathons through imaginary disasters. Breathing slows. The present moment becomes visible again. The sound of your own breath, the quiet rhythm of ordinary life continuing around you. And perhaps the most powerful realization emerges from that stillness. The inevitable was never the real enemy. The real enemy was the belief that you had to defeat it in order to live peacefully. Once that belief softens, fear transforms from a prison into something more like a compass. It reminds you that life is fragile, temporary, and therefore incredibly valuable. So the journey continues forward, not without fear, but no longer ruled by it. Walking through uncertainty with open eyes, aware that storms will come, aware that endings exist, yet choosing to step forward anyway. Because meaning is not found in a life free from the inevitable. Meaning is found in the courage to keep living while knowing it waits somewhere on the horizon. The moment we begin to understand fear, another feeling often steps quietly into the room, carrying a different kind of weight. Fear imagines the future. This feeling lives much closer to the present moment, tightening its grip around the body while the mind tries to keep up with everything life is demanding. It shows up in racing thoughts before an important deadline, in the tension across your shoulders during long nights of work, in the restless silence when your brain refuses to switch off even though your body is begging for rest. People call this experience many things, but most often it gets tangled into two words that sound similar, yet move through the mind in slightly different ways: stress and anxiety. At first, they feel almost identical, like two shadows overlapping in the same dim light. The heart beats faster, breathing becomes shallow, thoughts begin to race ahead, as if the mind is sprinting through unfinished conversations and unsolved problems. A student staring at an exam schedule feels it. A young professional juggling expectations feels it. Someone trying to hold together work, relationships, health, and ambition feels it pressing quietly from all directions. Yet beneath the surface, there is an important difference, a subtle shift that changes how these feelings behave inside us. Stress usually begins with something real and visible standing in front of us, like a heavy door that must somehow be pushed open. A deadline approaching, bills waiting to be paid, responsibilities stacking up faster than time allows. The body reacts like an emergency alarm system designed to help you rise to the challenge. Muscles tighten, focus sharpens, energy surges through the bloodstream like a silent command telling you to prepare for action. In small doses, this reaction is not the enemy. In fact, it has carried humanity through countless challenges, pushing people to study longer, run faster, adapt quicker. Stress, in its healthiest form, is the body saying, something important is happening. Wake up, pay attention, use your strength. But something changes when the pressure refuses to release. When days blur into weeks, and the alarm inside the nervous system never quite switches off, that sharp burst of energy begins to transform into something heavier. The mind stops focusing on the problem in front of it and starts wandering into darker territory, imagining what might go wrong next, what failure might look like, what disaster might follow if everything collapses. This is where anxiety quietly takes over the steering wheel. Unlike stress, anxiety doesn't always need a visible enemy standing in the room. It builds entire storms from invisible possibilities. The presentation hasn't happened yet, but the mind already imagines humiliation. The relationship hasn't ended, yet the heart rehearses loneliness. The future remains unwritten, yet the brain keeps drafting worst-case scenarios like a novelist addicted to tragedy. Anxiety feeds on uncertainty, stretching a single worry into an endless corridor of what-if questions that echo through the mind late at night when the world grows quiet. This is why people often feel confused by their own emotions, believing something must be wrong with them for feeling overwhelmed by threats that do not yet exist. Yet nothing is broken here. The brain is simply doing what it evolved to do, scanning the horizon for danger, trying to protect the fragile story of survival. The problem arises when that protective system forgets how to rest, when every shadow begins to look like a threat, and every quiet moment becomes another opportunity for the mind to rehearse disaster. Learning to navigate this landscape begins with a gentle shift in awareness. Instead of fighting every uncomfortable feeling, start by noticing what the mind is responding to. Is there a real pressure asking for action, something concrete that needs attention? If so, the body may simply be gathering energy to face it. Or is the mind drifting through imagined futures, replaying fears that have not happened and may never happen at all? That recognition alone can feel like stepping out of a fog. From that clearer place, small changes begin to matter. Slowing the breath so the nervous system remembers that the present moment is safe. Moving the body so trapped tension finds somewhere to go. Breaking overwhelming problems into simple actions so the brain stops drowning in complexity. Bit by bit, the storm inside the mind loses its intensity, not because life has become easier, but because awareness has returned to the steering wheel. Eventually, something quieter settles into the background of daily life. Stress still appears when challenges arise. Anxiety still whispers its warnings from time to time. Yet neither one holds absolute control anymore. They become signals rather than prisons, reminders that you care about your life, about your work, about the fragile future you are trying to build. So the journey continues forward through busy days, uncertain decisions, restless nights, and hopeful mornings, with a growing understanding that the mind was never meant to eliminate every difficult emotion. Its deeper purpose is learning how to move through them, carrying pressure, fear, hope, and resilience together, like different currents in the same vast ocean of being human. Once the difference between stress and anxiety becomes visible, a new question quietly emerges in the mind, almost like a whisper after a long storm. If stress is causing so much pressure inside our lives, shouldn't the solution simply be to remove it? The idea sounds comforting at first, like imagining a life where every deadline disappears, every responsibility softens, every difficult expectation fades into silence. For a moment, the mind paints a peaceful picture, a world where nothing demands too much from us, where pressure dissolves and calm becomes permanent. Yet life rarely unfolds inside that picture. And the more we chase the dream of a completely stress-free existence, the more we begin to realize that the problem may not be stress itself, but the way we understand it. Because stress, despite its exhausting reputation, is not always the villain in the story. In fact, many of the moments that shape our lives most deeply arrive wrapped in a certain amount of pressure. The nervous excitement before speaking in front of people, the intense focus before an important exam, the restless anticipation before stepping into a new job, a new city, a new version of ourselves. These moments stir the body into action. They sharpen attention, awaken energy, remind us that something meaningful is happening. Without that surge of urgency, many dreams would remain nothing more than quiet ideas floating through the imagination. This is where the misunderstanding often begins. When stress becomes uncomfortable, the instinct is to escape it completely, to believe that peace can only exist if pressure disappears. Yet removing every challenge from life would not create strength or confidence. It would create stagnation, a slow drifting away from growth. Imagine a muscle that is never asked to lift anything heavy. At first it feels comfortable, relaxed, undisturbed. Over time it becomes weaker, less capable, less alive. The same principle quietly operates inside the human mind. What truly drains us is not always the presence of stress, but the belief that we are powerless in the face of it. When the brain interprets pressure as a signal of danger rather than a call to adapt, the body remains trapped in a state of alarm. The heart races not because action is required, but because the mind is rehearsing failure, imagining collapse, whispering doubts about our ability to cope. This is when stress begins to morph into something heavier, something that seeps into sleep, concentration, relationships, turning everyday life into a battlefield of internal tension. Yet something remarkable happens when that interpretation shifts even slightly. The same surge of energy that once felt threatening can begin to feel purposeful. Instead of asking, "How do I eliminate every stressful moment from my life?" the question becomes far more empowering. How do I learn to move with this energy rather than fight against it? In that subtle shift, resilience quietly begins to grow. People who learn to navigate stress in this way do not live easier lives. In many cases, their lives are filled with responsibility, ambition, risk, uncertainty. The difference lies in the relationship they build with pressure itself. They treat it less like a warning siren and more like a signal that something important is unfolding. When tension appears, they pause long enough to listen to what it might be asking for: preparation, focus, rest, support, a change of direction. Gradually, the nervous system learns that not every racing heartbeat means danger. Sometimes it simply means life is asking you to step forward. The body gathers its strength. The mind steadies itself. Fear and excitement begin to feel strangely similar, like two sides of the same emotional current moving through the chest. From that perspective, the goal stops being the impossible mission of erasing stress forever. Instead, the journey becomes something far more meaningful, learning how to live alongside pressure without letting it define your worth or your future. Challenges will continue to arrive. Deadlines will still appear. Unexpected obstacles will rise from time to time like waves on an open sea. Yet somewhere inside that rising and falling rhythm, a quieter confidence begins to take root. The understanding that you do not need a perfectly calm life in order to feel strong. You only need the growing awareness that even in the middle of pressure, even when the mind trembles slightly under the weight of responsibility, there is still a steady part of you learning how to breathe, adjust, respond, and keep moving forward through the unpredictable landscape of being human. Pressure, when understood well, can become a quiet companion that pushes us toward growth. Yet somewhere along the path, that same energy can begin to change its shape. Almost like a river that once moved calmly through the landscape, suddenly swelling after endless rain, until the current that once carried you forward now threatens to pull you under. At first, the shift is subtle. The excitement that once sharpened your focus begins to linger a little longer than expected. The mind keeps rehearsing tomorrow's challenges even when the day has already ended. Muscles remain tense long after the task is complete, as if the body has forgotten how to release the armor it built to face the moment. What once felt like motivation slowly turns into restlessness, and the line between preparation and exhaustion becomes harder to see. This transformation is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It sneaks quietly into everyday life. A student who once felt energized by the thrill of learning now feels a constant pressure to perform. A young professional who once embraced responsibility begins waking up with a tight chest before the workday even begins. Even moments of rest feel uneasy because the mind keeps whispering about the next deadline, the next expectation, the next potential failure waiting somewhere in the distance. Good stress, the kind that once fueled effort and determination, slowly stretches beyond its natural limits. The human nervous system was never designed to stay on high alert forever. It was built like a carefully balanced rhythm. Moments of effort followed by moments of recovery, bursts of focus followed by periods of calm. When that rhythm breaks, the body begins sending signals that something inside the system is struggling to keep up. Sleep becomes lighter, sometimes restless. Small problems suddenly feel overwhelming. Motivation fades not because you no longer care, but because the emotional engine has been running without pause for too long. Strangely enough, many people misinterpret these signals as personal weakness. They assume the problem is a lack of discipline or resilience, believing they simply need to push harder, work longer, ignore the exhaustion creeping into their bones. Yet the truth is far more compassionate than that harsh inner voice suggests. When good stress turns into something heavier, it is often the body's way of asking for balance, not punishment. The mind, however, does not easily recognize this request. It keeps chasing the same strategy that once worked so well: more effort, more urgency, more control. That strategy may have helped you climb the first hill, but on a much longer journey, it can become the very thing that drains your strength. Imagine trying to sprint through an entire marathon. For a short distance, the energy feels powerful, almost unstoppable. Eventually, the body begins to falter, not because it lacks ability, but because endurance requires a different pace. This is the moment when awareness becomes incredibly powerful. Instead of seeing stress as something to either eliminate or endure endlessly, you begin to notice its signals with curiosity. The tension in your shoulders becomes information. The racing thoughts before sleep become a message. The fading motivation that once confused you now begins to make sense. These sensations are not random failures of the mind. They are reminders that the rhythm of effort and rest has drifted out of balance. Gradually, a different relationship with pressure begins to form. Challenges still exist. Ambitions still burn quietly inside you. Responsibilities still demand attention. Yet something softer enters the picture. The understanding that strength grows not only from pushing forward, but also from knowing when to pause, breathe, step back long enough for the nervous system to remember what calm feels like again. In that quieter space, something remarkable happens. Energy slowly returns. Thoughts become clearer. The same goals that once felt suffocating begin to look possible again, not because the challenges have disappeared, but because the mind is no longer fighting them while running on empty. And somewhere in that gentle recalibration, you begin to realize that resilience is not built by forcing yourself to carry endless pressure. It grows from learning the rhythm of being human, rising when life calls for effort, resting when the body whispers for recovery, moving forward again with steadier breath, aware that the journey was never meant to be a race against exhaustion, but a long unfolding path where strength and gentleness must learn to walk side by side. When the rhythm between effort and recovery begins to return, something subtle yet powerful starts to change inside the mind. The same pressure that once felt like a storm pressing against your chest no longer appears as an unstoppable force. Instead, it begins to feel like raw energy waiting to be directed. The heart still beats a little faster when challenges approach. The mind still sharpens when responsibility calls your name. Yet there is a growing sense that this surge inside you might not be an enemy after all. It might be something closer to fuel. For a long time, many of us were taught to treat stress as a signal of danger, as if every racing heartbeat meant we were losing control. Yet the body rarely creates energy without purpose. That restless surge in your system, the quickening breath before a big moment, the sudden alertness when something important lies ahead. These reactions were designed to help you meet life with greater strength. When the mind learns to recognize this, the experience of stress begins to transform. The same sensation that once felt like panic can start to feel like readiness. Picture a moment just before stepping onto a stage, entering an interview room, sitting down for an exam that might shape the next chapter of your life. In that quiet pause beforehand, the body vibrates with tension. Muscles tighten slightly. Thoughts move quickly. The instinct might be to wish those sensations away, to crave calmness instead. Yet if you look more closely, you may notice that this energy is not chaos. It is preparation. Your mind is gathering its focus. Your body is mobilizing its strength. The system is aligning itself for action. The turning point arrives when you stop asking, "How do I eliminate this feeling?" and begin asking a far more empowering question. How can I use this energy wisely? In that moment, the entire relationship with stress begins to shift. Instead of resisting the sensation, you start guiding it. The racing thoughts become reminders to clarify what truly matters. The tension in your body becomes an invitation to move, to stretch, to breathe deeply enough that the nervous system remembers it is safe even while preparing for effort. Gradually, the mind discovers that stress behaves differently when it is given direction. Unfocused stress tends to spiral into worry, pulling attention toward imagined failures. Focused stress, however, becomes something entirely different. It becomes drive. It sharpens concentration like a lens, bringing distant objects into view. It reminds you that this moment matters enough to deserve your full presence. Of course, this shift does not mean that life suddenly becomes easy. Challenges still appear, deadlines still approach, uncertainty still whispers its familiar questions late at night. The difference lies in how you interpret the signals rising inside your body. That quickened pulse is no longer a sign that you are falling apart. It may simply mean that you are stepping into something meaningful. Over time, this perspective builds a quiet confidence that cannot be easily shaken. Stress becomes less like a storm you must survive and more like wind filling the sails of a ship moving through open water. Too little wind leaves the boat drifting without direction. Too much can feel overwhelming. Yet with practice, awareness, and a steady hand on the wheel, that same force becomes what carries you forward. Somewhere along this journey, you may notice a surprising shift in how you experience difficult moments. Instead of shrinking away from pressure, part of you begins to lean toward it with curiosity. What is this moment asking of me? What strength is being called forward right now? The questions themselves create space inside the mind, space where resilience quietly grows. And in that space, life begins to feel less like a battle against your own emotions and more like a conversation with them. Stress speaks through sensation, urgency, movement. You respond with awareness, direction, breath. Back and forth the dialogue continues, shaping a deeper understanding of what it means to move through the world as a thinking, feeling, striving human being. So the journey continues with a steadier rhythm now, where pressure is no longer a signal to retreat, but an invitation to engage more fully with the life unfolding in front of you. A reminder that energy and challenge often travel together, and that within the rising pulse of stress, there may be the very spark that helps you step into the next meaningful moment waiting just beyond the horizon. When stress begins to feel less like an enemy and more like a current of energy moving through the body, another truth slowly comes into view. A truth that only reveals itself in the moments when life suddenly becomes difficult in ways we did not expect. Because understanding stress during calm days is one thing, yet coping when it truly counts. When the pressure is real, the stakes feel high, and emotions rise like waves crashing against the shore of your thoughts, is an entirely different experience. These are the moments that test the quiet skills we have been building all along. Picture a moment when the mind begins to spiral. Perhaps a sudden problem appears, a harsh conversation lingers in your chest, or the future suddenly feels uncertain in ways that tighten every muscle in your body. In those moments, the brain moves quickly, almost instinctively, trying to protect you. Thoughts multiply. Scenarios unfold. The heart beats faster, as if preparing for a battle you cannot quite see. Everything inside you urges immediate reaction. Say something. Fix something. Escape something. Yet coping in the moments that matter most rarely begins with action. It begins with something far more subtle. The decision to pause inside the storm rather than be swept away by it. That pause may last only a few seconds, but in those seconds something extraordinary happens. The mind, which was racing forward into imagined futures, begins to return to the only place where real control exists, the present moment. Breathing becomes the first quiet anchor. A slow breath in, a longer breath out. Nothing dramatic, nothing mystical, just the simple reminder that your body is still here, still capable of settling itself even while the mind trembles with uncertainty. With each breath, the nervous system receives a signal that the alarm does not need to stay at its highest volume. The storm does not disappear instantly, but the wind begins to lose some of its fury. From that steadier place, the mind can start asking better questions. Instead of the endless chorus of what if everything goes wrong, a new voice emerges. What is actually happening right now? Often the answer is surprisingly manageable. A difficult conversation, a demanding task, a painful emotion asking to be acknowledged. The mind had painted the situation as an entire collapsing future, yet reality usually reveals something smaller, something that can be approached one step at a time. This shift changes the entire experience of coping. Rather than wrestling with 1,000 imagined disasters, you begin responding to the single moment unfolding in front of you. Perhaps the step forward is speaking honestly. Perhaps it is stepping outside for a few minutes of quiet air. Perhaps it is allowing yourself to feel grief or frustration without immediately trying to silence it. Each small response becomes a thread of stability woven back into the fabric of your inner world. Over time, these moments accumulate into something deeper than simple coping. They become proof. Proof that even when emotions surge, even when fear whispers loudly in the background of your thoughts, you are still capable of meeting the moment with awareness. The storm may arrive, but it does not erase your ability to stand within it. What makes this realization so powerful is that it reshapes how the future feels. Difficult moments no longer appear as towering threats waiting to overwhelm you. Instead, they begin to look like challenges that may shake you. Yes, but not break you. The mind remembers the times you paused, breathed, responded rather than reacted. It remembers that strength is not the absence of emotion, but the ability to stay present while emotion moves through you. And so the journey continues through ordinary days and unexpected trials alike, each moment offering another quiet opportunity to practice this art of returning to yourself, until eventually coping when it counts no longer feels like a desperate survival strategy, but something closer to a steady rhythm of awareness, breath, and courage moving gently through the unfolding story of your life. As we become more capable of meeting difficult moments with awareness, a curious realization begins to surface, one that feels almost uncomfortable at first because it challenges a belief many of us have carried for years without ever questioning it. Somewhere along the journey of growing up, chasing goals, comparing our lives to the polished images of others, a simple idea quietly rooted itself in the back of our minds. I just want to be happy. It sounds innocent, even beautiful. Who wouldn't want happiness? It seems like the most reasonable wish a human being could have. Yet the longer we chase that idea as if it were a permanent destination, the more something strange begins to happen. Happiness, when treated like a place we must finally arrive at, starts to behave like a mirage on a distant horizon. We walk toward it believing that once we reach the right job, the right relationship, the right level of success or security, the restless tension inside us will finally settle. For a moment, sometimes it does. A new achievement brings excitement. A celebration fills the room with warmth. Laughter echoes through a good day, and we feel certain we've discovered the formula at last. But then life does what life has always done. The mood shifts. A challenge appears. A worry returns. Suddenly the happiness we were holding so tightly slips through our fingers like water. This is the quiet trap hidden inside the sentence, "I just want to be happy." It assumes that happiness should be the constant background of a well-lived life, and when it isn't, we begin to believe something must be wrong. The mind starts scanning for mistakes. Why do I still feel anxious? Why does sadness appear even when things seem fine? Why does stress return when I thought I had everything under control? The more we ask these questions, the more our natural emotional rhythm begins to feel like a personal failure. Yet emotions were never designed to stay frozen in a single pleasant state. They move like weather across an open sky. Some days bring warmth and sunlight that fill the body with lightness. Other days carry clouds, wind, even rain that soaks through our thoughts and slows our steps. Neither condition is a mistake. Both are part of the landscape of being human. When we try to eliminate the uncomfortable weather entirely, we end up fighting against the very system that allows us to feel alive. Consider what sadness reveals when we listen closely. It often appears when something meaningful has been lost or when the heart is processing disappointment. Anxiety arrives when the future feels uncertain or important decisions lie ahead. Anger can emerge when boundaries have been crossed or values feel threatened. These emotions are not random intrusions destroying our happiness. They are signals, each carrying information about what matters to us. When the goal shifts from being happy all the time to living a meaningful life, the entire emotional landscape begins to make more sense. A meaningful life will inevitably include joy, curiosity, love, excitement. Yet it will also contain moments of grief, fear, frustration, and doubt. These experiences do not cancel each other out. Instead, they weave together to create depth, much like shadows and light shaping the contours of a painting. This shift in perspective softens the pressure we place on ourselves. Suddenly, it becomes acceptable for a day to feel complicated rather than perfectly positive. You can wake up feeling uncertain and still move towards something meaningful. You can carry anxiety into a challenging conversation and still speak honestly. Happiness stops being the fragile goal you must protect at all costs. It becomes something that visits naturally when life aligns with your values, your efforts, your connections with others. And perhaps the most surprising thing happens once that pressure fades. When you stop chasing happiness as a permanent emotional state, it begins to appear more often, slipping quietly into ordinary moments you might have overlooked before. The warmth of sunlight through a window, the relief of finishing a difficult task, the calm that settles in your chest after a long breath. Gradually, you start to see that happiness was never meant to be the entire story. It is one beautiful note in a much larger piece of music, rising and falling among other notes that create the full richness of the melody. The aim was never to silence every difficult emotion. The aim was to keep walking through the changing landscape of experience with curiosity, courage, and a willingness to feel whatever this strange, complicated, deeply human life chooses to place gently in your path. Once the pressure to feel happy all the time begins to loosen its grip, a quiet space opens inside the mind, a space where a deeper question can finally breathe. If the purpose of life is not to chase constant happiness, then what exactly are we moving toward? For a moment, that question can feel unsettling, almost like standing at the edge of a vast landscape without a map. Yet hidden within that uncertainty is the beginning of something far more meaningful than the fragile pursuit of good moods. It is the moment when a person begins the slow and fascinating process of working out what truly matters. This discovery rarely arrives as a sudden revelation. Life does not usually hand us a neat list of priorities or a perfectly clear sense of direction. Instead, understanding what matters tends to unfold through experience, through moments that leave an emotional imprint strong enough to make us pause and reflect. Sometimes it appears in the warmth of connection with another human being, a conversation that lingers in your thoughts long after it ends. Other times it emerges in quiet solitude, when you notice which activities bring a subtle sense of aliveness, even when they require effort or discipline. Yet the modern world often makes this process more confusing than it needs to be. Everywhere we look, messages whisper about what we should value: status, productivity, admiration, achievement, endless busyness. Social media scrolls past with carefully polished versions of success, each image suggesting a life that seems perfectly arranged. Without realizing it, The mind begins absorbing these signals, measuring personal worth against expectations that may have nothing to do with who we truly are. This is where many people drift into a strange kind of emptiness. They follow goals that appear impressive on the outside, yet something inside feels strangely hollow. Motivation fades. Stress increases. The mind begins to wonder why reaching certain milestones fails to create the deep satisfaction that was promised. The answer often lies not in a lack of effort, but in a misalignment between what we are chasing and what genuinely matters to our inner world. Working out what matters requires a different kind of attention. It asks us to notice the subtle emotional signals we usually rush past. What kinds of moments make you feel quietly proud of yourself? When do you feel most connected to other people? Which experiences leave you with a sense that your time and energy were spent in a way that feels worthwhile, even if no one else applauds it? These questions do not demand immediate answers. In fact, the process works best when approached with curiosity rather than urgency. The mind slowly begins to notice patterns. Perhaps kindness toward others brings a deeper satisfaction than competing for recognition. Perhaps creativity, learning, helping, building, exploring, or understanding something complex awakens a sense of purpose that external rewards never quite provide. Gradually, these discoveries begin shaping the direction of everyday choices. Decisions become less about chasing approval and more about aligning actions with values. Work becomes not just a way to survive, but an opportunity to contribute something meaningful. Relationships become spaces where authenticity matters more than perfection. What makes this shift so powerful is that it changes the role of difficult emotions as well. Stress no longer feels like pointless pressure when it appears in pursuit of something meaningful. Fear becomes easier to face when it guards the doorway to a life that reflects your true priorities. Even setbacks begin to look different, less like proof of failure and more like part of the unpredictable journey of building a life that actually belongs to you. Over time, a quiet sense of direction begins to emerge. Not a rigid plan for the future, but a deeper understanding of what deserves your time, your attention, your energy. The noise of external expectations softens slightly. In its place grows something steadier, something rooted inside your own experience of the world. And somewhere along that unfolding path, you may realize that meaning does not arrive all at once like a grand discovery waiting at the end of the road. It forms gradually through the small, consistent act of choosing what matters again and again, until your days begin to reflect not just what life demands of you, but what your heart quietly knows is worth showing up for. As the quiet understanding of what truly matters begins to settle inside you, life starts to feel a little less like a race toward distant achievements and a little more like a path you are actively shaping with each step you take. The question slowly shifts from what should I be chasing to something far more powerful. How do I build a life that actually means something to me? This question does not demand a grand answer all at once. In fact, meaning rarely appears through dramatic turning points or sudden life transformations. More often it grows quietly in the background of ordinary days, forming through the small choices we repeat over and over again. At first, this realization can feel surprisingly simple, almost too simple to believe. We often imagine that a meaningful life must look extraordinary from the outside, filled with remarkable accomplishments or constant excitement. Yet when people reflect deeply on the moments that truly shape them, the scenes that come to mind are rarely loud or dramatic. They are often quiet moments of connection, acts of kindness that left a lasting ripple, times when courage showed up despite fear whispering in the background. Meaning begins to grow in the places where your actions align with the values you have slowly uncovered. When you give your time to something that reflects who you want to be, even the effort itself begins to feel different. The work may still be difficult. The journey may still contain stress, uncertainty, and moments of doubt. Yet underneath those challenges, there is a steady current of purpose, a sense that the direction you are moving in holds weight beyond temporary comfort. This is why a meaningful life does not require the absence of struggle. In many ways, struggle becomes part of the architecture that supports it. Think about the times when you have worked through something demanding, learning a difficult skill, supporting someone through a painful moment, standing up for something you believe in. Those experiences rarely feel easy in the moment. They stretch your patience, test your confidence, challenge your emotional strength. Yet when you look back later, those are often the very moments that carry the deepest sense of significance. Part of creating a meaningful life involves embracing a different relationship with discomfort. Instead of interpreting difficult emotions as signs that something has gone wrong, you begin to see them as companions along the road. Anxiety might appear when you step toward growth. Fear might surface when you protect something valuable. Sadness might emerge when you care deeply enough to feel loss. These emotions are not obstacles blocking the path to meaning. They are often the proof that you are walking it. Gradually, life becomes less about eliminating every uncomfortable feeling and more about choosing what kind of experiences you are willing to endure those feelings for. A person who values creativity may accept the frustration that comes with imperfect work. Someone who values connection may face the vulnerability of honest conversations. Someone who values learning may tolerate the confusion and mistakes that come with trying something new. This shift transforms everyday living into something richer and more intentional. The morning routine becomes a quiet opportunity to care for your mind and body. Conversations become chances to understand another human being more deeply. Even the way you respond to setbacks begins to change, because each challenge becomes part of the story you are building rather than a detour away from it. Over time, the sense of meaning does not arrive as a sudden reward waiting at the end of the road. It grows gradually within the journey itself, woven into the choices you make, the effort you invest, the compassion you show toward others and toward yourself. It appears in the moments when you notice that your life, imperfect and unpredictable as it may be, is slowly beginning to reflect the values you once discovered in quiet reflection. And somewhere along that unfolding path, you may find yourself standing in an ordinary moment, nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, yet feeling a calm sense of alignment between who you are and how you are living. In that quiet alignment, meaning stops being something you search for in the distance. It becomes something you are already creating, step by step, breath by breath, through the simple yet powerful act of showing up for a life that matters to you. When life begins to feel aligned with what truly matters, another truth slowly rises into view, one that quietly shapes almost every meaningful moment we experience. Even the strongest sense of purpose rarely grows in isolation. A life filled with meaning eventually leads us toward the people who walk beside us, those whose presence turns ordinary days into something warmer, deeper, more human. The journey inward, the search for values and resilience, gradually opens the door to something just as important: the relationships that give those discoveries a place to live. Human beings were never designed to move through the world completely alone. Beneath our ambitions, beneath the goals and responsibilities we carry, there is a quiet longing for connection. It appears in subtle ways: the relief of being understood, the comfort of laughter shared at the end of a difficult day, the silent reassurance that someone else sees the effort you are making even when the world feels heavy. These moments may seem small, yet they often become the invisible threads holding our lives together. Still, Relationships rarely unfold as effortlessly as we imagine they should. Just like the inner world of thoughts and emotions, connections between people carry their own complexity. Misunderstandings appear. Expectations collide. Sometimes we hide pieces of ourselves out of fear that honesty might push others away. The mind begins to construct quiet defenses, believing that protecting our vulnerability will keep us safe. Yet those same defenses can slowly create distance. When we guard our true thoughts too tightly, when we present only the polished version of ourselves, the connection remains shallow, like a conversation echoing across a wide room where nobody quite steps close enough to hear the truth beneath the words. The paradox is that real connection often requires the very thing we try hardest to avoid: vulnerability. Vulnerability does not mean revealing every detail of your inner life to everyone you meet. Instead, it is the gentle courage to allow another person to see parts of your real experience, the uncertainty, the hopes, the imperfect pieces that remind us we are human. In those moments, something remarkable begins to happen. Instead of pushing people away, honesty often draws them closer because it gives them permission to be real as well. Relationships thrive not through perfection, but through presence. A friend who listens without trying to immediately solve every problem. A partner who remains patient during difficult conversations. A colleague who notices when someone is struggling and offers quiet support. These gestures may appear ordinary on the surface, yet they create an environment where trust begins to grow. Trust, once built, becomes one of the most powerful forces in emotional resilience. When life delivers its inevitable challenges, stress, loss, disappointment, the knowledge that someone stands beside you changes the entire landscape of the experience. Pain shared does not disappear, but it becomes lighter to carry. At the same time, meaningful relationships ask something important from us as well. They require attention, effort, and sometimes the humility to admit when we have misunderstood or caused harm. Growth within relationships mirrors the growth within ourselves. Both involve patience. Both require compassion. Both unfold slowly through countless small moments of care. Over time, you may notice that the pursuit of meaning naturally circles back to these connections again and again. Achievements can be satisfying. Personal goals can bring pride. Yet the memories that linger longest are often the ones shared with others. The conversations that stretched late into the night. The laughter that arrived unexpectedly, the quiet support offered when words were difficult to find. And somewhere within those shared moments, a deeper understanding begins to settle gently into the heart. A meaningful life is not built solely from individual strength or personal success. It grows from the space between people, from the invisible bonds formed when we choose to show up for one another with patience, honesty, and care. In that shared space, life feels less like a solitary journey and more like a path illuminated by many small lights, each one carried by the people who walk beside us, reminding us that even in our most uncertain moments, connection itself can become one of the most powerful sources of meaning we will ever find. As relationships begin to reveal their quiet power in shaping a meaningful life, another realization slowly rises into awareness, one that many people hesitate to face at first. Even with supportive friends, loving partners, or caring family members, there are moments when the weight we carry inside becomes too complex to untangle alone. The mind may try to convince us that we should be strong enough to handle everything ourselves, that asking for help somehow means we have failed at being resilient. Yet resilience has never meant isolation. In truth, some of the strongest people are the ones who eventually recognize when their inner world needs more than silent endurance. There are times when emotional struggles feel temporary, like passing storms that eventually move on. Stress appears during busy periods. Anxiety rises before important decisions. Sadness lingers after disappointment or loss. These experiences are deeply human, part of the natural rhythm of living. With time, reflection, and support from the people around us, they often soften and fade. But occasionally something different happens. The storm does not move on. The mind continues circling the same painful thoughts. Motivation begins to slip away. Simple tasks feel heavier than they used to. Sleep becomes restless, or perhaps exhaustion never quite lifts no matter how long you rest. In those quiet moments, many people begin to question themselves. Why can't I just fix this? Why does everything feel so difficult? The inner voice may become harsh, suggesting that others seem to manage life without falling apart. That perhaps this struggle is a personal weakness rather than a signal that something deeper needs attention. Yet the truth is far more compassionate than those thoughts allow. The human mind is incredibly complex. Just as the body sometimes requires medical care to heal an injury or illness, the emotional system can also reach points where guidance from someone trained to understand it becomes deeply valuable. Therapists, counselors, psychologists, these are not distant experts standing above your struggles. They are guides who have spent years learning how thoughts, emotions, and behaviors intertwine, and how people can gently reshape those patterns when they begin causing harm. Seeking help does not mean you have lost control of your life. In many ways, it means the opposite. It is the moment you decide that your well-being matters enough to deserve attention. It is the quiet act of saying, I do not have to face every shadow alone. Often the most powerful part of this process is surprisingly simple: being heard. Imagine sitting in a space where someone listens without judgment, where the tangled thoughts inside your mind can unfold slowly without interruption. In that environment, emotions that once felt overwhelming begin to make sense. Patterns become visible. The mind starts recognizing the habits that may have been quietly feeding cycles of stress, anxiety, or self-doubt. From there, new possibilities begin to appear. Practical tools emerge, ways to calm the nervous system, challenge unhelpful thoughts, build healthier routines, reconnect with purpose. None of these changes happen overnight, yet each step creates a small shift in the landscape of your inner world. What many people discover along the way is that asking for help does not replace their own strength. It strengthens it. Support becomes another layer of resilience, much like the relationships that surround us. Instead of standing alone against life's difficulties, you become part of a network of understanding and care. Eventually, the fear around seeking help begins to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of respect for the courage it required. Because reaching out during moments of struggle is not a sign that you are broken. It is a sign that you are paying attention to your own humanity. And within that attention, something gentle begins to grow, a deeper trust that whenever life becomes heavy again, whenever the path forward feels unclear, there will always be ways to find guidance, support, and understanding, reminding you that even the most complicated chapters of being human are not meant to be walked through alone. By the time a person learns that seeking help is not a weakness but a form of courage, something subtle begins to shift inside them. Almost like the quiet turning of a compass that has finally stopped spinning wildly and begun pointing somewhere steady. Because the journey through stress, fear, self-doubt, grief, and confusion was never about eliminating these emotions completely, but about learning how to walk beside them without losing yourself. And that realization alone carries a strange kind of peace, the kind that doesn't shout triumph but whispers understanding. Because life, as it slowly reveals itself, is not a smooth road built only for happiness. It is a landscape of changing weather. Some mornings arrive with sunlight pouring through the windows of your mind, filling you with energy, curiosity, hope. Other days feel like fog rolling through your thoughts, dulling motivation, whispering doubts, making even simple tasks feel strangely heavy. For a long time, many people believe that the goal is to chase the sunny days and escape the fog forever. But somewhere along the journey, a deeper truth appears. Meaning does not come from perfect weather. Meaning grows from learning how to move forward through all of it. This is why the difficult emotions you have encountered along the way were never meaningless obstacles. Anxiety tried to protect you from danger. Stress pushed your body to prepare for challenges. Grief reminded you that something mattered deeply. Even self-doubt, painful as it can be, revealed the places where you care about growth, about becoming someone better than you were yesterday. When these emotions spiral out of balance, they can pull you into darkness, yet when understood, they become signals guiding you back toward what truly matters. Somewhere within this journey, you may have noticed something remarkable about the human mind. It changes. The same thoughts that once felt like permanent storms slowly lose their power when you learn to observe them rather than obey them. The same habits that once drained your energy can be replaced with small, intentional actions that slowly rebuild momentum. A walk outside, a conversation with someone who listens, a moment of stillness where your breathing reminds you that you are here, alive, capable of beginning again. Over time, these small shifts accumulate quietly, almost invisibly. One day you realize that the spiral that once pulled you downward has begun turning in another direction. Not perfectly, not permanently. Life will always bring new challenges, new fears, new moments where uncertainty returns. But the difference now is that you carry tools you did not have before. Awareness, compassion for your own mind, the courage to reach out when the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone. Perhaps the most beautiful discovery of this entire journey is that a meaningful life is not built by avoiding struggle, but by learning how to move through it with intention. Every step you take toward understanding yourself creates a ripple that touches your relationships, your work, your creativity, even the quiet way you exist in the world. Meaning grows from those ripples. So if something in these reflections has stirred a new perspective inside you, hold on to that feeling. Let it remind you that growth is always possible, even when progress feels slow. And if you'd like to continue exploring ideas like these, stories, insights, and powerful lessons from life-changing books brought to life through immersive storytelling, then take a moment to support the journey. If this experience resonated with you, consider liking this audiobook, sharing it with someone who might need these words today, and subscribing to CliffNote Chronicles for more full-length audiobooks in English that transform powerful ideas into stories you can listen to, reflect on, and carry with you long after the final words fade. For now, take a quiet breath, notice the space around you, and remember that the path toward resilience, clarity, and meaning does not require perfection. It only asks that you keep walking.